So it is a great pleasure and a great relevance that we have an opportunity to take a moment and to actually step out of the very fast lane and sit down and think about the impact that our various studies and efforts have on the society, and ask ourselves questions of what we are doing, why we're doing it, and how we are affecting our fellow man's day-to-day life and the immediate future of our society on many levels. So for that, I thank you all for that study. I hope it's something that we continue to do here at City Tech and in other colleges, and we hope for greater collaboration. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Landhart, who will then convene the proceedings. Thank you very much, and again, welcome to City Tech. Steve Lusher is chemistry professor.
Actually, I'm not Ann Landhart. I'm Peter Spillane, a colleague and one of the gang of four on this project. It's my pleasure to introduce Scott Hartley, our first speaker of the afternoon. And let me tell you the data, the story. He's a venture capitalist and a global startup advisor, a former presidential innovation fellow at the White House. He's worked at Google, Facebook, Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society. He's written for Forbes, Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and other publications. And he has a book which is doing really well. It was just published this year. The name is The Fuzzy and the Techie. I hope he might explain what those words mean, if you don't already know. I suspect you will. But I'll tell you the subtitle to this really nice book. It's called Why the Liberal Arts Will Rule the Digital World. So it addresses very much the subject matter of this project that we've worked on for a year and a half around the college. I told Scott about 25 years ago, when I was maybe more than that, when I was a graduate student, I read a book that a friend recommended. It was called A World Lit Only by Fire. And it's written by William Manchester, who writes history, he's an American historian. And there was one line, I think only one line, that I've not stopped thinking about in all that time. It was something of a definition of the humanities, which I thought it's a word that I certainly have been familiar with already, probably for 15 years, but never heard anyone describe. William Manchester says, at a time at the end of the Middle Ages, when all study was focused on the divinity, there came a time when people thought we have to study the needs and desires and ambitions and potential of humans. So I really, as I say, that's one line 25 years ago, and I think about it, this book, I think, might be the follow-up, at least for my own purposes. Anyway, I look forward to hearing Mr. Hartley, Scott Hartley. Scott Hartley lives in Brooklyn.
Just down the street. All right. So, well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to get to come in my hometown, just down the block, to give a lecture to you all here. A little bit about the book, and then also just sort of broadly about my sort of experience coming from Silicon Valley and sort of observing technology, observing the trends that we sort of lionize and put on this pedestal as deeply technical, and really sort of peeling back the onion on that and sort of explaining why I think that there's so much that's rooted in the liberal arts, rooted in the humanities, and why these subjects are still so important, even in this sort of technologically led world. So I want to take you guys back to 1959 and a guy named Charles Percy Snow. So C.P. Snow, as he was known, was both a physicist and a novelist. So he was somebody that sort of straddled these two different worlds of the sciences and the humanities. And C.P. Snow gave a famous lecture at Cambridge that became known as his Two Cultures lecture. So he really lamented this growing chasm that he saw kind of developing in society, where he said, there's this change that's happening where people that study Shakespeare are only reading Shakespeare and they don't know the first law of thermodynamics, and people that are studying physics or chemistry, aren't reading some of the great works of literature. And what if we could kind of bring these worlds together and break down the two cultures? And fast forwarding almost 60 years to today, we might say, well, today we've got majors that blend both sides, and we've got different ways that we're starting to put these two pieces together. But when I look around Silicon Valley, which is sort of my lens in my home, there's a focus on code. There's so much emphasis on learning to code, on science, technology, engineering, and math, that often we forget about the context. We forget about what are the big problems that we're solving. What are the things that we're truly passionate about? What are the deepest kind of human problems that we face? We talk a little bit about the buzzwords like artificial intelligence, AI, but we're only starting to scratch the surface on some of the ethical questions, some of the broader philosophical questions about, if AI is touching our lives in new and different ways, how are we going to manage when the employment staff on the floor at Home Depot, for example, is run off of an algorithm? Those are coded by individuals with certain propensities and certain biases. There may be good things in that AI, but there may also be things that are subject to challenge that we may need to think about from an ethical or philosophical standpoint. So it's not just sort of a monolith of tech. It's there are all these sort of deep humanities questions that are embedded there. And again, we talk about STEM, and we open the newspaper on a daily basis, and we'll see articles sort of talking about the importance of investing in science, technology, engineering, and math, which obviously we do at a university like this. But we have to take a step back and say, well, implicit in the STEM, we've got the natural sciences, which are part of the liberal arts canon. We've got mathematics, which is part of the liberal arts canon. So it's not sort of one versus the other. It's about how we kind of bring these two together. So the book that I wrote, thanks for the shout out and the introduction. It's great to kind of see it in the physical form. It comes out in paperback in a couple months, which I'm excited about. But these terms, the fuzzy and the techie, they're not terms that I came up with or invented. They're actually terms that date back to the 1960s, 1970s at Stanford University, so across the country, a place I flew back from early this morning. So apologies for any jet lag. But at Stanford, the terms fuzzy and techie were kind of these lighthearted monikers on campus where if you studied the humanities or the social sciences, people would kind of say, well, how many fuzzy classes are you taking this quarter? Versus if you're studying electrical engineering or the computer sciences, people might say, well, are you more of a techie, are you more of a fuzzy? And again, these were just lighthearted associations on campus, but implicit in that, nobody is sort of uniformly techie or uniformly fuzzy. If we kind of peel back the onion on, looking at a mechanical engineering degree, you're interviewing people, you're doing customer experience research. It looks a lot like anthropology sometimes. And, vice versa, if you're studying economics, you might be doing statistical studies using software. So then it's, in some degrees technical. And so my background and sort of where I'm speaking from and where the book really draws a lot of its context for me is from the world of venture capital. So venture capital, or VC, is basically funds that invest in entrepreneurs. And so you're meeting a lot of companies, you're meeting a lot of early stage entrepreneurs, and you're working with a team of people and making decisions around when and where you think innovation is going. And then you're placing small sort of investments in those teams, and then you're helping shepherd those companies forward in the hopes that one of them becomes the next Google or Facebook or whatnot. And so really, the context for me in writing this book, the kind of impetus for why I thought this conversation was important, was because over the past 5 or 6 years, I've met with around 3,000 different startup companies. And these startup companies, you might think, well, these are tech companies, they're from Silicon Valley and places like that. They must all be created by computer scientists and engineers. And in fact, you look around Silicon Valley, and this is just a snapshot some of the founders, some of the people that don't necessarily have those degrees. And I was really struck, whether it's Peter Thiel, who we hear about in the media these days, one of the founders of PayPal, who's actually a philosopher and a lawyer. Stuart Butterfield, who founded a new company called Slack, which we may be starting to use in some of our companies and classrooms. Slack, Stuart Butterfield has 2 degrees, and they're both in philosophy. So we're in good company here in the first row with our philosophers. And so just looking around Silicon Valley, I wanted to take a step back and kind of myth bust this notion that tech is a monolith, where if you didn't study certain things when you were 14 years old, you're somehow locked out of this world, because that's not at all the case. There are a lot of roles, there's a lot of ways that we can all participate. Myself as well, I was a political science, political theory major, kind of 1 foot in philosophy, 1 foot in politics. And really this was about kind of answering questions that I had to face in my own world, where extended family would say, hey, wait a minute, you work at Google, what do you possibly do there? You're not an engineer. And the joke we had was, well, somebody's got to run back to the file cabinets and look up the search information when you search. But obviously, in actuality, the questions that are faced by any product team, as I'll kind of go through, so many of these questions today are philosophical, they're psychological, they're sociological, they're thinking about sort of the world and the needs of the consumer that you're building for. And so today I want to tell you guys 3 sort of quick stories that all come from the book. I won't, spoiler alert, I won't spoil too much of the book, so there's still kind of more where this came from. But I really want to kind of myth bust some of the terminology that we hear from Silicon Valley, and sort of just open the aperture on how these things are not kind of uniformly techie, but they actually are rooted in a lot of sort of humanities, and rooted in a lot of the broader context for why we need to study things other than just science and technology. So the first term I want to myth bust or talk about is this term big data. So a few years ago, from my seat in VC land, a lot of the slide decks, a lot of the PowerPoint presentations that we saw from companies, they morph every few years. They have a different word on them. So a few years ago it was big data. Recently it was AI, and I think now it's mostly blockchain. And so the words change, but the underlying sort of theme is the same. We're trying to disrupt industries, disrupt different worlds. And so there's one company that we met with a few years back called Kaggle. And Kaggle was founded by an Australian economist, a guy named Anthony Goldbloom. And Anthony was an economist sitting in Canberra, Australia. He went to actually work and write for The Economist magazine. And there he was writing this article about big data, and he had this realization that data is sort of locked up in all these different organizations, all these different entities. And what if you could kind of release it and crowdsource against it and have people asking questions of the data, but from many different lenses, from many different backgrounds. And so he created this company called Kaggle, where companies can basically post a data set, and then anyone, anywhere in the world can look at that data and start asking questions of it, trying to basically win a prize to get the best answer to the question that the company or the organization poses. And so one of the first examples of this, NASA and the Royal Astronomical Society and the European Space Agency released a data set where they said, we're trying to quantify the amount of dark matter that's out there in the universe. So physicists will know what I'm talking about, but this is a little bit above my pay grade. But dark matter, is out there in the universe. We know that it exists, but we don't quite know how to measure it. So NASA and these different organizations had come up with approximations, but they said, what if we released our data set and we saw, if somebody else from a different domain, a different background, maybe would have a different way of approaching this problem. And so they released the data, and within about 2 weeks, there was a guy named Martin O'Leary who was sitting in the UK, and he was actually a glaciology PhD student. And he had been used to looking at images of icebergs and stuff from space and measuring the edges of those icebergs, and he had certain ways that he was asking questions of approximating things that you couldn't really see. And so he actually came up with a closer approximation of dark matter than NASA had thought about over the past decade, he came up with in about 2 weeks. So it's a really interesting example, and I think kind of proved the value of something where with Kaggle, you know, we talk a lot about data science, but I think there's this sort of notion of the alternative, data literacy, and how do we ask the right questions. So, you know, going back to Voltaire, a few hundred years ago, you know, I'm paraphrasing the quote here, but you know, judge a person not really by their answers, but judge them by their questions. And I think that, you know, in this era of Google, where we say, well, the world's information is sitting there on your computer, all you have to do is put it in and you can get any answer, so why even bother to learn things? But the real thing that we learn, the real thing that we teach, you know, is how to ask the right questions. And I think that's what we face. That's the challenge today. So many days I sit in front of Google with the flashing cursor, and you say, "Gosh, you know, the world's information is at my fingertips. I just don't know what to ask it right now." So this notion of data not really being equal to knowledge, knowledge not really being equal to wisdom, it's in sort of how we coax it, how we ask the questions. What's interesting about this is in the research for the book, going back through hundreds of years of history, this is something that, you know, it's not just a new phenomenon. You know, today we have the Internet of Things, and we think about sensors on our watches, on our clothing, and we have this sort of explosion of data. Somehow this is going to lead to infinite knowledge, and suddenly we're going to have all the answers because we have big data. And in fact, you know, these are the same challenges that Plato was talking about and Sir Francis Bacon was talking about hundreds of years ago. And so we maybe have more data now, but I don't think we necessarily jump right to wisdom. You know, we still have to go through these important questions. So, you know, in paraphrasing Gary Kasparov's recent book, although I liked thinking about this term before that was even the title of his book, we need deep thinking humans, you know, not just deep learning AI. So the second story that I want to talk about relates to a term that's probably as or even more familiar than big data, and it's this term, you know, algorithms. So we talk a lot about algorithms, and you know, just because we can codify a process into a repeatable process, and we can put it into ones and zeros, and we can generate an automation to it, it doesn't somehow make it magical or objective or infinitely relevant. And so one of the companies that we met with that does a lot with algorithms is this company called Stitch Fix. And I don't know, show of hands in the audience if anyone's familiar with these companies. Let me know. We've got a couple hands in the audience. But Stitch Fix is it's sort of a Netflix for fashion, if you will. And so they are really rooted in trying to algorithmically predict what types of clothing individuals want. So you connect a Pinterest board, or you answer a long survey, and you say, you know, I like blue sweaters and red shirts, and they start extrapolating off of that, and they start sending you boxes of clothes, and whatever you don't like, you send back, and whatever you like, you keep and you pay for. But through that, they're really a data science company, so they're learning all of these things about your preferences, just the same way that Netflix learns all about your preferences from what you watch and how long you watch it and all those things. And the team actually behind Stitch Fix was the same team that built Netflix, a guy named Eric Colson, who ran the data science team at Netflix. And what's really fascinating about Stitch Fix is it's not trying to just do tech. It's not just sort of algorithmically driven. What Eric, the guy behind the Stitch Fix algorithm, is building is something he calls his H algorithm and his M algorithm. And H is for human, M is for machine. And he says, you know, machines are really good at the sort of mathematical optimization within the traveling salesman problem. We have certain warehouses, we have certain SKUs of clothing, we've got to get the right SKUs to the right boxes to the right person as fast as possible. That's stuff that machines are really good at. But humans are really good at the face-to-face interaction, the sort of the empathy, the dealing with the client, the customer. And so he also recognizes that humans aren't infallible either. You know, we have our own propensities and biases, and we live in certain places, we have our own experiences. And so what he does is he uses an algorithm to both optimize the delivery of the clothes, but also to mitigate the biases of the stylist. So he says, let's look at what some stylist is sending over and over, and if they have certain things where they're maybe overly fashion forward or they're overly conservative, we can actually offset their bias by serving them clothes that sort of mitigates that bias that they have as a person. And it's a really interesting kind of tweak on, not algorithms taking over jobs, but really supplementing humans and making us more effective at whatever we do. And if you look at the DNA of Stitch Fix, it's, there's a lot of data scientists. They've got about 70 or 80 people writing algorithms and working on data science, but they've got 3,400, I think now it's close to 4,000 people that are they're basically the human-to-human interface. And so this company just went public here in New York about a month ago. And so, they're still in the early days, but they're really expanding. But I think this ratio is something interesting to look at, that, as we have these debates about automation and AI taking over things, this is a good example of, just from sort of empirically looking at a lot of these companies in Silicon Valley, this is more the ratio of things that I see working. So flipping the letters around, not artificial intelligence so much, and that's a nice word, but intelligence augmentation, thinking about how are these technologies actually improving our lives? How are they helping us be better at our jobs? And I think that's sort of an interesting wrinkle on this debate. So the third story that I want to talk to you guys about is this idea of the attention economy. And this is something that's also been in the news, and I think has a lot of philosophical questions and ramifications and things that we can think about on the panel. Is technology is not there's a debate. Is it agnostic, or does it kind of come with its own baggage? And we're starting to see through social media and some of these tools, that if you build a tool, people come, and then when 1 billion people come, there's maybe philosophical, societal, sociological questions you start asking, where you say, is this really what we want people to be doing with our technology? Maybe this has gone too far. And so Steve Jobs had a great quote. This was back in, I think, in the early 80s, when sort of some of the earlier Macs came out. And he said the personal computer should be, a bicycle for the mind. It should really enable us to do more than we could do on our own. If you've been following any of the debates about the attention economy, there's a guy named Tristan Harris, who was an entrepreneur, sold his company to Google. Then at Google, he sort of looked around and said, we're building these products that are touching 1 billion people, 2 billion people. And I look at the composition of the teams of who's building these products, and the product manager, the engineering manager, a few people in the room have very similar backgrounds, very similar socioeconomic status, very similar outlooks on the world. We lost the presentation. and just taking a step back, said we need to think about sort of the composition of teams, and if what we're building. Well, that's okay. So basically, so Tristan, he likened some of the technology that we're dealing with today. He says, it's really gone from being a bicycle for the mind to being a slot machine in our pocket. And it's become this thing where we have infinite scroll baked into Facebook feed and Instagram feed, where you're thumbing through photo after photo. And at some point we start asking the question of, are these design levers that have been baked into our technology, are these things that are optimizing for the type of outcomes that we want? So Tristan kind of poses some of these big philosophical questions. And I think he brings to the forefront this debate about the attention economy and how do we use technology, build technology that solves fundamental human problems. So one of the other people that I wanted to talk about in this sort of domain is a woman named Tracy Chou. And Tracy, I've got an image of her, and she was recently on the cover of MIT Tech Review. because she's sort of brought this debate to the forefront about diversity in teams and how we have to really sort of think critically about who's asking the questions in these product rooms. You know, if we have 5 people building technology that impacts 1 billion people, you know, what's the composition? What are the things those people are versed in and thinking about? And so Tracy's examples, she was one of the earliest employees at 2 different tech companies. One was Pinterest, and one was a question and answer website called Quora. And at Quora, she realized that she was one of the only people that was asking about sort of moderation and what people would potentially be doing on the platforms. And these earliest questions about if they had, you know, open access for people to contribute whatever they want, ask whatever questions they want, those assumptions, you know, would people abuse the tech? Would they ask positive questions? You know, these sort of early questions that they were asking were very philosophical in nature. You know, they were sort of about human nature. They were about the ability to, let's see here, jump back in. So I think it's around, give you guys the fast forward version here. So if you missed any slides, here they are again. Okay, well, sorry about that. So basically, the last section that I sort of want to talk about a little bit, there we go. Okay, so here's the Tristan Harris bicycle from my slot machine in our pocket. You know, questions of what are we optimizing for? So Tracy really asks these questions in an interesting way, where she realized that at Quora she was in what she called kind of the corner case. So in engineering terms, being sort of you know, what are all the different cases we're thinking about, and it really takes having somebody that's going to be personally impacted by a potential abuse of a platform that says, you know, wait a minute, we need to be thinking about these things. So she was really the one that brought sort of questions of moderation and how would you moderate a forum like Quora to the forefront, and I think just gives a good example of the fact that you need to have people thinking about these questions from multiple angles. You can't just sort of release them in the abstract and say, well, the technology is purely agnostic, it's up to the users to use it in positive ways. I think it's also up to the technologists to nudge and sort of provide the platforms that that lead to kind of optimal outcomes, whatever those might be. So, you know, one attempt at thinking about this is how do we bring diversity into those environments? You know, not just socioeconomic diversity, not just racial diversity, but sort of intellectual diversity, and thinking about, you know, maybe we need a philosopher on the product team. Maybe, you know, Daniel Kahneman from behavioral economics talks about inside-outside bias. You know, you have a lot of insiders who think about things in a similar way. Oftentimes you need somebody to think from a different angle. And I think that goes back to the Kaggle example as well. You know, of this glaciologist, Martin O'Leary, able to provide insight to NASA because he really had kind of a completely orthogonal, completely different angle of thinking about the problem. And so those are kind of the stories that I wanted to tell you guys about. And then this is a primer for, I think, when we get into the panel. You know, one of the biggest questions today is about, you know, where does this all go? We hear all these terms like big data and algorithms and artificial intelligence, but how does this impact me, you know, in my life with automation and the future of jobs? And, you know, so we have all these buzzwords, and kind of the data behind it, you know, a few years ago in 2014, there was a big study that came out at Oxford, and they said, you know, 47% of US jobs are at high risk of machine automation. And I think everyone's jaw dropped and said, oh my gosh, this is a scary time. You know, Martin Ford's book came out. It's a great book about the rise of the robots. You know, and I think the pendulum was really swinging toward fear. And really, in the book that I wrote, in sort of the perspective that I wanted to bring was, based on seeing 3,000 companies in Silicon Valley and beyond, bringing that pendulum back toward hope, because I think that when we hear about terms like Mark Andreessen, who founded Netscape, he talks about, software is eating the world, and it has this very sort of visceral negative connotation to it. But at the same time, what that means is that technology platforms are touching all these different verticals, all these different domains and different parts of our lives, that it really brings the opportunity to be an entrepreneur, the opportunity to participate in one of these companies, to people from all walks of life and all different backgrounds. So I don't even talk about them today, but the number of companies where somebody has come out of a background in trucking or a background in a different domain where they really understand a problem and they partner with a technologist. And I think these are the types of examples and the types of opportunities that exist, in this world where software is eating the world. So I really wanted to bring the pendulum from fear, kind of maybe not all the way to hope, but certainly along that spectrum. So more recently, McKinsey Global Institute came out with a study. This was the start of 2017, and they said, let's look at 800 different jobs. And if we look at jobs, every job has a bunch of different tasks, and some of those tasks are really routine, really boring, really rote. Those are things that over time we can either give to a robot if it's a manual task, like in a factory, or we can give it to machine learning if it's sort of a rote cognitive task that we're doing over and over again. So they found that about 5% of those jobs had, 100% of the tasks were things that we could maybe automate technologically. Whether or not we would choose to or dedicate the resources to or the money to is another question. But what they found that I thought was more interesting is that it's really about flipping those letters again. So artificial intelligence or AI, flipping that to intelligence augmentation or IA, because for 30% of the tasks, or for 60% of jobs that they looked at, of these 800 jobs, only 30% of the tasks were things that technologically we could get better at optimizing. And so I think that is much more like the Stitch Fix example, where technology will augment some of the things that we do. It'll give sort of the scale efficiencies of large companies suddenly to smaller groups, which has impact for sure. And I think this is a broader conversation and one that we can kind of get into this debate. But I think this is a really interesting look at kind of beneath the surface of when we think about jobs. We're really talking about constituent tasks and which of those minute tasks are things that we can build technology for. And it's going to make economic sense to substitute technology for labor, because that's the bigger question is, just because we can build it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be mass adopted everywhere immediately. It's going to take decades. It's going to take more time than I think we're giving it credit. So the framework that I sort of use in the book and thinking about some of these things are, if you take tasks and you divide them into what's manual and what's cognitive, that'll give you a sense of thinking about this debate of robots and machine learning. Robotics is for manual tasks, whereas machine learning is for cognitive tasks. I think it just kind of gives you a framework to think about these things. And then, to the study, thinking about what's routine. If you think about your own job, what are the things that you have posted on the wall where it's a best practice and you can easily give it to, a younger employee or somebody that you hire. Very easy to kind of hand off those tasks when you go on vacation. Maybe those are things that are highly routinized. Those are the things that over time we could probably automate to some degree, and we don't even think about how this is already embedded into our lives, whether it's in the form of spell check or auto formatting or email response or social media management, auto retweets of things. There are many ways that we're already kind of using these things to make our lives easier and a little bit more efficient. So that's sort of the framework that I would think about, is looking at your own job, looking at those tasks within the jobs that are simple, that are routinized. Those are things that maybe over time susceptible to machine automation in some way, shape, or form. But really where this kind of goes is, if kind of going up the funnel from simple tasks to complicated tasks, where we go with this is, the tasks that remain are really the ones that are complex thinking. So they're the ones that are non-routine. It's about being an improviser. It's about being sort of on the forefront of thinking creatively. of collaborating with your team, of communicating with other people. And so, you know, the subtext in the second deck of the book, which, you know, was kind of introduced earlier, is why the liberal arts will rule the digital world, which is sort of a strong statement. People say, are you serious? You know, do you believe this? Is this a book of nonfiction, or is this a book of fiction? And I say, no, it's nonfiction. It's, you know, it's empirical. It's based on a lot of interviews and data that I pulled from my life in Silicon Valley. And it's really rooted in this idea that we have to be asking the right questions in order to take technology and apply it meaningfully to all these ways that software is going to eat the world. And so, you know, I think that the skills that are really important, that will remain important, you know, going into this sort of technologically led world, are the ability to ask the questions. You know, there is certainly a role for training machines, for interfacing with machines, whether that's writing code or that's dealing with, you know, creating taxonomies for data and things like that. But really, even that requires context. And then I think the jobs that are sort of around the human-to-human interface and sort of bringing technology to domains that are outside just the infrastructure of technology, I think are really important. And so, you know, in kind of final thoughts, if flexible skills and complex thinking are the things that really matter in this more machine-led, algorithmically determined, you know, robotic world, I don't think we need to have so much fear. We need to focus on these skills that are about learning to learn, learning to sit in front of Google and ask the right questions. Information is not going to hit us in the face. And there's a metaphor that I really like, that I was talking with the vice provost for undergraduate education at Stanford right when the book came out, and he said, you know, a lot of my students, a lot of people that I deal with, they think in terms of their education as a plane ticket. And they say, you know, they debate the merits of flying to Shanghai or to Dublin. You know, is a degree in anthropology better than a degree in computer science? And he said, this is the wrong framework. We need to think about our education in terms of a passport, where we don't debate the merits of getting to destination A or B, but we think about filling out a passport with stamps from all the different places. And I really like this metaphor because as somebody, you know, who studied political philosophy and political science, I recognize my own deficiencies in computer science or in data science. And I work hard to try to get some of those stamps, whether it's a General Assembly class or a Treehouse lecture online. And so I think we all need to think about vice versa. You know, if you're really passionate about coding and about these things, it's also important to think about public speaking, to think about sort of empathy in the form of maybe it's joining a fiction book club where you have to debate works of fiction and put yourself in another time, in another place. And so I think if we can all kind of holistically think about our educations as works in progress, as sort of being in beta, like an engineering term, for you know, the duration of our lives, not just the 4 years that we're in university, I think this is sort of important in thinking about, you know, how we build flexible skills where we're all kind of breaking down the walls of these two cultures and we're, you know, trying to blend them together. You know, and the data really points to this. So David Deming, who is an education economist up at Harvard, he basically has looked at data around sort of where the job growth really is, and he's concluded that it's not in pure technology. It's actually in what he calls high math, high social. That's where the most outsized returns in job growth have been over the past couple decades. And it's, you know, it's in being sort of technically conversant, but you don't have to be fluent necessarily. You got to be conversant. You got to sort of know where the toolbox is. But I think then you also really need to have this sort of ability to apply the technology and be communicative and be you know, social as well. So that's sort of the conclusion of my talk, is thinking about, you know, not just how we build things, not just what we build, but why are we building them? And I think that's sort of the big question that I try to bring to Silicon Valley, and you know, I'm trying to bring sort of writ large. And you know, I'm not the only one, I think, starting to hit on some of these themes. There are, you know, other people like this guy here, Tim Cook, who, this was at the MIT commencement this past May, where he said, I'm not worried about artificial intelligence giving computers the ability to think like humans. I'm really concerned with people thinking like computers without values or compassion. And so I think when you listen to, there's a lot of hype around these terms, but when you listen to somebody like Tim Cook, who's front and center in this debate, building the technology that we're using on a day-to-day basis, these are really the concerns of a lot of people that I think don't get as much airtime as some of the fear-mongering. So that's sort of my thoughts, and thanks so much for having me, and I guess we'll turn it over to a couple other talks, and then we'll have a little conversation here later.
I think indeed the plan is that we hear another talk and ask questions later. Is that right? Is that what we came to? So hold your questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. Here's Scott's book.
I'd like to welcome everyone, and I have the distinct honor to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Julian Floyd, a professor of philosophy at Boston University. Her work spans the philosophy of logic, mathematics, and scientific method. She received her PhD from Harvard University and is Associate Senior Editor, 20th Century Philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and co-editor of the book Philosophy of Emerging Media, which deals with the understanding, appreciation, application, and philosophical explorations of the legacy of Alan Turing. She's also co-directing a Mellon Foundation, the Sawyer Seminar Grant on Humanities and Technology at the Crossroads. Dr. Floyd co-edited books Philosophy of Emerging Media with James Katz, and also philosophical explorations of the legacy of Alan Turing, Turing 100 with Elisa Bokulich, as well as the forthcoming co-authored book with Felix Mulhauser, Wittgenstein's Annotations to Hardy's Course of Pure Mathematics. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Floyd here. She spoke for us previously, and it was quite stimulating, and we needed an encore, so I will hand the floor over to our esteemed speaker.
Thank you so much, Satyanand. I'm hardly as esteemed as the other people on this panel, so I just want to thank you for the invitation. He was a former undergraduate student of mine, of whom I'm very proud, so thank you very much. Scott, I couldn't have made a better plea for philosophy, so I feel as though I in a sense, have no argument to make. So what I'm going to do is to come in from the side of philosophy and tell you about what I've been doing over the last year and a half, thanks to the Mellon Foundation's support. The Mellon-Sawyer seminars are interdisciplinary in nature. They are supposed to give the humanities a voice and push the humanities to go out into the wider world. So in effect, we've had a temporary center for about a year and a half, and we will be running seminars through the spring. So my slideshow is essentially just a picture of each of the seminars we'll be running, and then I will introduce you to the wonderful Mellon-Sawyer fellows who we have appointed, who are postdoctoral researchers in Boston. connecting up the institutions of MIT, BU, and Harvard, and doing incredibly interesting work. So I'm trying to get to philosophers out of their inward-looking state and out into the world. And it fell to me partly because I've worked for a very long time on the history of the foundations of math and logic, and Wittgenstein and Turing in particular. And Scott's talk reminds me very much of something Turing wrote already in 1948 in the founding document of AI, a report he wrote on the National Physical Laboratory called Intelligent Machinery. And in my view, Turing was a student of Wittgenstein's and learned a lot about asking hard questions and foundational questions. Wittgenstein also learned a lot from Turing, and we would not actually have Wittgenstein's later style of writing, which is only questions, if he had not read on computable numbers. So I can defend that historical claim later. But for me, the two cultures are very much embedded in the rise of AI. You cannot understand anything, even the central arguments of uncomputable numbers, unless you understood that Turing was educated in just the way Scott is calling for, with philosophy a very big part of that, Gödel as well in Vienna. So what Turing wrote at the end, toward the end of this wonderful, incredibly prescient work on artificial intelligence, was he said, we want to investigate the question whether intellectual activity and intelligent activity largely consists in searching. Now you might think of Google there, but actually what he had in mind was that there are different kinds of search. The first search he talks about, he calls intellectual searches. He says these will be searches where we look for an algorithm to solve a mathematical problem or set up a routine that we can check for correctness. Those are intellectual searches, and he said, I'm sure there'll be a lot of investigation of that. The second kind of search he called the biological search, in which is the quest through evolution and DNA for health and the survival of humanity. But there's the third search, which he called the cultural search. The cultural search does not involve machines, it involves us looking for culture, where we're not quite sure where to look, and we're not quite sure what the constraints are on that problem to begin with. And it's very moving to me that he said that, because I think we are very much involved now in what he called the cultural search. And what he says about the cultural search is, the important thing here is to understand that we have to involve the human community as a whole. So, in the spirit of that, I applied for this Mellon Foundation grant, and I'll just take you through a tour now of what we're doing with the money. So I'm going to give you an overview, tell you about the past seminars we ran last spring and this fall, the future ones, and then I'll introduce you to these wonderful young fellows who exemplify to me exactly the spirit of what Scott was talking about. So I'm a co-PI on the grant with two others. Fortunately, James Katz was hired by BU to start the first PhD program in their communication school about 3 years ago. He's an expert on social media, worked at IBM, was one of the first people to predict the ubiquitous use of cell phones. He's a sociologist by training, interestingly. And what he understands is that the empirical investigation of what is going on with social media is not a trivial thing. And knowing the engineering behind it is not going to be enough. You have to work phenomenologically, as Scott was saying, at the human end to see what's going on. So I'm very fortunate to have someone who actually has some empirical data about sociology and social media. My other colleague is a philosopher of biology, Russell Powell, who has a law degree and worked in the pharmaceutical industry for years. He's a fantastically good philosopher of science working on the evolution of morality and how we think about in-group, out-group behavior over time. So our first meeting invited a French philosopher, actually, to talk to us, who is Paris's great moment for philosophy of communication right now. Maurizio Ferraris is appointed at the École d'études normales in Paris. And he was a student of Derrida's, interestingly, and then he broke with Derrida and decided the world is not all just a matter of science and the play of science. The world actually is very real. So he's pushed this externalism about meaning and talked to us about European initiatives to study philosophy of communication. And I believe that there will be a strong concentration. The French will invest in having their philosophers looking very carefully at social media and other connectors. His view is that somehow writing and recording is very central to what's going on right now. I think perhaps he overemphasizes that, so we had a very nice discussion of that, but that was a small meeting. A larger meeting took place, interestingly, during the runoff to the French election. And in fact, the French consul of Boston provided us with 2 experts from Sciences Po who came to tell us about fake news in the French election. So it turns out that debunking of myths during that election was much more organized in France. There were various things we learned at this conference. People worry about epistemic bubbles, that people get online and only see news from a certain point of view. The empirical data do not show that. People who are online are actually much more likely to be seeing different perspectives. So this was very fascinating. And of course, the question of truth for a philosopher like me is absolutely central. So fake news is an old problem. It's not new. But there's a lot of skepticism and fear, obviously, after our last presidential election about how many big fat ones you can tell. So I guess my bottom line answer to that, I'll think of Wittgenstein. We are not in post-truth culture if you talk face-to-face. The Speech Act is where it really hits the road. As Wittgenstein said, it's what people say that's true and false, and what they agree in is the harmonies of interaction that lie behind that Speech Act. So I think the problem of nonsense is very real. Wittgenstein worried a lot about the limits of sense. It's a very real problem, but it's nonsense rather than necessarily truth and falsity. Okay, whoops, okay. Our next one in September of this fall was on hypermedia platforms for studying philosophical texts. So we had Thomas Barcher, who's putting together the Hannah Arendt archives, the first critical edition of her work. Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, sales have gone up over 400% since the last election. So Arendt is a very regular, very read figure, and we had the people who were working on Wittgenstein's archives, and we hope that the methods used, that the Nietzsche source was the other example used, we hope that study of history and study of philosophy could be opened up to the wider public by having nicely designed platforms where, for example, in Nietzsche source, you can actually click on an aphorism of Nietzsche's and go back down and see all the draftings of that remark down to the little thing he wrote on the back of a postcard when he was riding around. So we're going to hope to bring all of that to the analysis of Wittgenstein's text, and I think that will open up Wittgenstein's work enormously, particularly in relation to Turing and mathematics. But other philosophers too, because it's important, given diversity issues, that we make sure to have hypermedia platforms, maybe fan platforms for a variety of different thinkers and not just the usual well-known famous ones. So that was very interesting. We got into a lot of discussions about what counts as the integrity of a text, what you really want in putting philosophy up there, and so on. We then had Sandra Logier come from Paris. Sandra and I were both students of Stanley Cavell's and Hilary Putnam's at Harvard back in the 80s. And Sandra is an expert at importing American philosophy into a French context and then exporting it back. So she is very interested now in the ethics of care. Care is kind of a maybe seemingly flabby word, but actually it runs completely antithetical, I think, to the tone of rhetoric we're getting out of Washington right now, and it's very powerful. People care about care. We worry about health care. We should be worrying about the people who take out the trash at the end of this lecture. We need to actually think about the grit of what's going on in many aspects of our lives. So I find it a very powerful kind of notion. And she's also an expert on film and binge watching and television. So we have concocted, with the support of, I believe, possibly the embassy in Washington, to go out and study social media and the philosophy of popular culture. Because in many ways, how popular culture represents us is going to be an incredibly important part of our political solutions to what is going on, as well as allowing people the idea of watching maybe a TV series or a film as a way of exploring another form of life, or coming to terms with the kind of skeptical fears we have. So this, I think, will be very exciting to explore skepticism in popular culture. And we have another meeting planned, in fact, for the spring. We then had our big data conference, and Sabina Lovbond, who's head of a very large ERC grant at Exeter in England, attacked, as Scott began to, the idea of big data as some kind of giant empiricism, where now we have all of this data, so our knowledge will be bigger because we have more data. This is, of course, a myth worth busting. And in fact, her area is data in biological sciences, and she made a real pitch for our thinking about the people who actually provide these databases and have to work with them over time, nurture them. It's really data-centric science in many ways, and the art of handling these biological donations and biological ways of retaining data over time was her theme. John Simons also joined us, and he's very interested in what he calls post-human science. What are we going to do when deep learning algorithms make predictions that we don't really understand how they came up with, and provide surprising ideas for things that then begin to change human behavior? So what is post-human science? Maybe there is such a thing as post-human science. What do we do with, for example, the European Court's ruling on the right to an explanation of an algorithm? How do we think about the notion of explanation in a context of massively computationally driven science? And then finally, we're fortunate enough to have Jack Copeland and Diane Proudfoot of Canterbury in New Zealand. They founded the first Turing archive and are now involved in Zurich at the Swiss Institute of Technology on Turing, and they came and lectured to us. Jack is probably the world expert on Turing and the history of computability, and they gave an absolutely wonderful lecture about the Turing test and what the Turing test is and what the Turing test is not. Turing was a very sharp philosophical logician. He never said he was giving a definition of intelligence. It's not a definition. No, it would be something like maybe a sufficient condition. But the interesting thing is that Turing thought intelligence was what he called an emotional concept. What he meant by an emotional concept was a response-dependent concept, like the notion of color maybe, or like the notion of freedom of the will or intention. So in fact, this idea of Turing having bet everything on the Turing test is just simply not true. And if you begin to think about the Turing test in terms of what it shows about the humans, rather than what it shows about the machines, you get a much more interesting picture of the potential of Turing's thought. So I'm now going to turn to the future ones that we're going to hold this spring. We're very fortunate in January we'll have Alexa Koenig come and visit. She has won a MacArthur Award recently for an initiative she undertook at the University of California at Berkeley with undergraduates. She herself is appointed at the law school. There are thousands and thousands of videos coming out of Syria, for example, every month. And the question is, what kind of evidence do those videos provide for what actually happened at the everyday human level of care? Let's say on a street corner in Homs. There are many problems with eyewitness testimony, but the technology may provide a way for us to reconstruct very humanly relevant things about what has happened. So she partnered with Amnesty International. Amnesty does not have enough labor to throw at the problem of verifying that many videos. However, Berkeley has a large number of interested undergraduates. So what she won the MacArthur Award for was to crowdsource the issue of developing standards of geolocation verification for these videos, certifying the students, training them, talking about how the human end of verification is done. And the hope, I think, is that there will be standards that could be developed for verification that could be used in international war crimes trials, as well as history. So I think that'll be very interesting. I've paired her with Anat Beletsky, a philosopher now at Quinnipiac and who taught in Tel Aviv for years. I'm very interested in activism, social activism, and how social media is affecting that. And Anat Beletsky is herself very far on the left, I would say, in terms of Israeli politics. But she was head of B'Tselem, which is the human rights organization for the occupied territories, or was head of it for many years. And they were the first to hand out video cameras to Palestinian teenagers to start recording incidents of potential human rights violations. And the trouble there is there's a very large archive now sitting in Tel Aviv of videos from the 1990s. And the question is where to send that. So she's working with American libraries, I think Duke is among them. How do we archive activism and make that part of the historical record? Finally, Peter Manning will join us. He's a sociologist and ethnomethodologist of policing at Northeastern, and he has worked around the world, particularly in Northern Ireland, also in the United States, on democratic policing. We delegate to police all kinds of activities. And how do you actually foster, with technology, more humane interactions at the level of the street from an ethnological perspective? So I think that'll be a very exciting session in January. We've added a new one now in February. Sandra Logier will return, and we will explore the theory of Apparatgeist, which Jim Katz developed in the 1990s. When mobile technology first started coming out, there were various predictions made about the use of mobile technology. For example, we know that people are more angry with mobile technology. They use curse words more often. There are various things you can find out. And we want to go back and test this theory from the 1990s against what we know now about social media use in order to see whether that social theory could get some philosophical rigorization. So I think this will be a very interesting chance to revisit Bourdieu, many social theorists of the 80s, and see if we can redo them in a new vein. Our ninth one will be something I spearheaded most of all, given that I work on Gödel's philosophical notebooks. There are copyright problems with making that material available to people. Gödel began these notebooks in the early 1940s. They're very rich. They're very extremely interdisciplinary. One has to know a great deal about Viennese history, about philosophy, about the foundations of mathematics and physics to even begin to understand what kind of brainstorming was going on. And worse than that, they were written in Gabelsberger shorthand, which was the shorthand used in Vienna. So the labor to extract from the Gabelsberger a workable edition is enormous. And there have been some European efforts in this regard, but they are now asserting copyright over the material, making it impossible for an interdisciplinary international team to actually help with the edition. So we will hear from the person involved in handling that copyright issue, Casey Westerman at the Institute, and he will join Peter Zuber. The issue of copyright is really a big deal for those of us working in history and philosophy of 20th century material, because copyright has not always expired, but we need to have teams of interdisciplinary researchers looking at this. So this will be the focus of that event. Then we decided to work with our cyber law unit in March and the Hariri Institute for Computational Sciences. And what we're going to do is to run 3 roundtables, and no one of them is allowed to only have computer scientists and cyber law people at it. They all have to have somebody from sociology, African American studies, philosophy on them. So we're kind of throwing a day-long dinner party. And the 3 themes of those roundtables will be algorithms and the criminal adjudicative process. Are there some things we don't want automated, and other things maybe we do? Maybe we want stop and frisk automated. Maybe we don't want sentencing automated. So we will put people in the ring and let them deliver 2 minutes on their spiel. The second roundtable will be privacy and then the Internet of Things. And we've invited a young philosopher who works at Google. She's interested in consciousness and robots and so on. Susan Schneider, she'll give a public lecture the day before. Human plasticity and human-machine interface will take place on April 9th, and we will be inviting a variety of different philosophers from around the world looking at cultural and philosophical aspects of what it tells us about human and machine interface. This is co-sponsored by the Harvard Center of Bioethics through one of our fellows, to whom I'll introduce you in just a moment. We've added one on facial recognition. I'm sure you've heard about the recent event of unintended data mining, which yielded through an analysis of Facebook pages, the ability to predict gender orientation very, very closely on the basis of facial recognition. So we will invite people in to work with that. And the last event we're going to run is co-sponsored with the History of Science Department at Harvard, and that's grappling with how we think about time, how we actually think about the future over the long range, whether we're talking about climate, cataclysmic episodes from the point of view of climate, or near-term nuclear problems in the immediate. How do we manage our expectations in a way that makes everyone confident that reasonable diversity of perspectives on this are being weighed? So that'll be our final event of the spring. And again, all of these are public events, so if anyone wants to come, just feel free to be in touch. And I'm now going to just briefly introduce you to what we did with some of our funding, which was to appoint these fellows to give them time to talk with one another and join up institutions in Boston and sort of put our heads together across a variety of disciplines. So John Burmeister graduated from BC with a degree working on Hegel's notion of logic, so he's really a 19th century historian, but he got very interested in work in automation. So he's now working on Hannah Arendt and on Marx. He's going to be writing probably a book on the history of worries philosophers have had about this. And he's doing a really interesting job at trying to get the conversation in Boston around work and leisure going. Of course, it's as ancient as Aristotle to think about what is work and what is leisure, what is routine and what is not routine. These are important distinctions, but of course, as Scott knows very well, they're not handed down from Mount Sinai. So what is routine and what is not always so clear. Sina Eftekhari was a student who came up from the University of Kansas with our new dean, Ann Cudd, whom I want to give a shout out for. Ann Cudd is the new Dean of Arts and Sciences at Boston University, and she has been thinking a lot about the issues Scott is talking about. What is the liberal arts in a computational era? And she's actually enacting that by helping the School of Arts and Sciences through a major transition at Boston University right now to try to bring general education across all 16 schools and colleges. So what you do very well here at New York Tech, we are just learning how to do. And Sina is her student who works on classical questions of capitalism and political theory. Let's see. David Leslie was scooped away for the fall semester to teach with Peter Singer at Princeton, but he's now back for the spring. And he's very interested in how we think about catastrophic scenarios. That's really the thing he's thinking about most. But he's widely educated in social theory, knows a great deal of history, and I think he lends a very special kind of breadth to us. He's also written a bit on Turing about the cultural surge, and this is how I met him. So he's going to really boost us from the point of view of social theory. Wendy Salkin has a JD from Stanford, and she's now completing her PhD at Harvard. And she works on philosophy and bioethics, Black political thought, and her big theme is informal representation. So we have formal democratic processes, and then we have the very difficult question of what it is to feel like you have a voice. And that's a somewhat mysterious thing, but it's something that we can hopefully philosophize about. And Wendy is just a terrifically talented person thinking about diverse angles from which philosophers might think about these issues. Loris Becker-Sullivan will be helping to organize that co-sponsored event on human-machine interface. And she too had an extremely interesting fellowship. She read Wittgenstein as an undergraduate and got very interested in cross-cultural approaches to philosophical thinking, then went out to Hawaii, did a degree in Japanese studies, learned Japanese, and went and studied human-machine interface interactions in the medical setting in Japan for several years. So she's very interested in the fact that in Japan, where essentially a decision has been made not to use immigration to take care of an older generation, people's feelings about robots and what it is to put a robot in the room with an elderly person are rather different from the way we feel, let's say in the United States, where we don't have a national healthcare system, and things are a little scarier. So she adds terrific cross-cultural breadth for us with Asian philosophy. And finally, Zeynep Soysal, my very first postdoc, who is absolutely a wonderful philosopher. She, like me, studied the epistemology of set theory and foundations of mathematics. So she's fascinated, as I am, with incompleteness, with the limits of what we cannot write algorithms for. But she's also a Turkish citizen. She was educated in the United States, so she's very much a citizen of the world. She's fluent in French as well. And she's gotten very interested in the issue of epistemological deference. So one of the issues now is we have to defer to experts, right? Whether we're talking about reading a newspaper article or examining an iPhone. There's a lot of deference involved. That means that there's a division of linguistic labor and conceptual labor, as my teacher Hilary Putnam would have said. There's no dichotomy between facts and values here. We are entangled in values every time we look at any kind of complicated object. So she's going to really, I think, focus on the issues of deference, which are very serious issues for journalists. So I think that's about all I have to say. We have future plans. I'd love comments from the floor about what your dream ticket might be if you were given a follow-on grant. I'm trying to rework a double major in computer science and philosophy at BU, so I've been teaching computer science students with Jack Copeland this fall. We find them in need of help asking questions. They tend to show up and write down notes, and we tell them to just throw that all away because we want to talk to you about where meaning is and how you feel about that. But I think our graduate students, we're trying to push them to be a bit more interdisciplinary and get to know what's going on, let's say in social media, if you're working on social philosophy, because the fact of the matter is how we represent ourselves is part of the representation of reality itself. These things are really entangled with one another, and so we're hoping to push them. I'm hoping to do a little bit of so-called experimental philosophy with Jim Katz. We may try to do some sociological investigation of what, for example, when we talk about privacy, what are people really worried about? Most of us think we know, but until you actually go out and ask people, you don't know. Finally, social media is fascinating. There's a whole team in the Division of Emerging Media at BU who work on fantastically interesting network analyses of the use of, for example, hashtags like Black Lives Matter during the Ferguson riots. There are many things to learn about legacy news organizations and the ways in which they are more and more relying on eyewitness testimony from individuals using Twitter. Jacob Groshek was one of the co-authors on a paper that analyzed the riots in Ferguson, and it's extremely interesting to see who were the hashtags who were connecting groups otherwise unconnected with one another. It was not the legacy news organizations. In the case of his article, it was one person who was a former superintendent of schools in St. Louis. So there are many interesting things to learn about the social processes that are surrounding our embedding of humans with technology. But I think I'll just stop there and look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thanks.
It is my privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Stephen Wolfram, creator of Mathematica, Wolfram Alpha, and the Wolfram language. He's also the author of A New Kind of Science and the founder and CEO of Wolfram Research. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, he has been a pioneer in the development and application of computational thinking and has been responsible for many discoveries, innovations in science, technology, and business. Wolfram was educated at Eton, Oxford, and Caltech, where he received his PhD in theoretical physics. Wolfram's early scientific work was mainly in high-energy physics, quantum field theory, and cosmology. In 1979, he began the construction of SMP, the first modern computer algebra system, which he released commercially in 1981. He is known for his work in computer science, mathematics, and theoretical physics. The Mathematica software he invented automates calculations, and Wolfram Alpha knowledge-based engine lays behind Siri and other artificial intelligence interfaces, which is seen as a new interface for computation that will enable humans and machines to interact at a vastly richer and higher level than ever before. He's the author of A New Kind of Science, published in 2002, where he calls for a revolution in traditional mathematical methods. Wolfram language, an innovation based on the deep technology stack that Wolfram has developed over 3 decades, introduces the new concept of a knowledge-based language in which immense knowledge about computation and the world is integrated, and a new level of highly automated programming becomes possible. I would also like to add that we've used Mathematica extensively in CUNY, and we have site license, and we've done some wonderful work, especially in 3-dimensional printing. And I will now hand over to our esteemed guest.
Well, so you're looking at such an intriguing title that I felt I had to try. I hope to be able to come across it, unfortunately. I'm not able to, so I could conduct a whole here. So, the cultural history of digital technology. Okay. One of the things that I think is interesting to understand kind of in the long view of history is, what will the late 20th century, the early 21st century be known for? I think the most important kind of paradigmatic shift that we're seeing is this idea of computation. The notion of computation as an important element of our way of thinking about the world and so on. And what we saw maybe 300 years ago or so now was a transition from kind of the pure abstract natural philosophy to the idea that we could use mathematical, as Newton's book, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy tried to say, to an idea of using things like mathematics, which have been invented for other purposes, for commerce, for land survey, and things like that, before, to be able to use that to understand the natural world. And from those ideas of using mathematics to understand the natural world came the idea of doing engineering and so on based on mathematical principles, and that's been sort of a dominant theme of the last 300 years. I think the thing that we are now seeing in the last few decades, and which will happen to a historical extent in the next few decades, is the use of computation as kind of a key paradigm for thinking about things. And I guess my rule of thumb about sort of the way things are going is, imagine some field of human endeavor X. Might be archaeology, might be zoology, might be anything in between. There either is now a computational X, or there soon will be. And when there is a computational X, it's pretty much defining the future of that field. And so the question then is, how do we think about this thing, this idea of computation? What is the idea of computation? How do we understand it? How do we think about it in the context of sort of the long arc of development of ideas and of technology and so on? And I think one of the things I like to think about is kind of, when we talk about technology, we can ask the question kind of, what is technology? Technology is typically the taking of what exists in the universe and directing it for human purposes in some way. And so one question that we might ask is, in this idea of computation, what is sort of the computation that exists out there? So I got interested in that many years ago now. I was sort of interested in what are the possible types of computation that can happen? When we make programs for practical purposes, we typically write some long program that's intended for some very specific objective. If we just ask them sort of computational universe of all possible programs, what's out there? We're looking at computation in its kind of rawest form. So one of the things I looked at is, imagine that one's just looking at all possible programs. So here's an example. Can you see this on the screen? Yes? No, you're not seeing it.
No.
Let's see how we share that screen. Let's see, I have to go somewhere. Hold on. And click something. So I right click. Okay. Interesting. Oh, there we go. How fascinating. That's a weird user interface element. Okay. Share screen. Which screen is it sharing? Okay, that was good. Now, maybe I'm still visible, maybe it's visible, I'm not sure. But anyway, so what I was talking about was kind of what is, when we ask sort of, what is computation in raw form? What kinds of, in sort of the computational universe of all possible computation, what's out there? This is an example of a super simple computation. This is a cellular automaton. It just consists of a line of black and white cells, and each step it colors a particular cell going down the page. It colors a cell black. If in this particular case, any cell above it or immediately to its left or right was black on the step before. And if I can only find my mouse here, let's see if I can. Okay, maybe help. There we go. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to navigate this through. Oh, okay, great. Okay, here we go. All right, so we can kind of summarize what happened in that picture here. And we're saying there's a particular rule by which we determine the color of a cell based on the cell above it. And that icon at the bottom represents, in a sense, the rule of the program that makes this pattern. So in this particular case, very simple rule, very simple behavior. So what I was interested in one time ago was to sort of turn one's kind of computational telescope out into this computational universe and see what's out there. If we look at other possible programs, what do we see? Well, here's another example of a possible program, same type of program, and in this particular case we don't get quite a simple pattern, still something quite simple. But if we keep going, we ask, well, what's possible when we, in this computational universe, possible programs? Here's another example. This is now another program, same type. The pattern is slightly more intricate. If we run a bit longer, we'll get this nice nested fractal pattern. Very intricate pattern, but nevertheless a very regular pattern. So the question that I asked a long time ago is, if we look in this kind of computational universe of possible programs, what's out there? So here's a collection of the first 64 programs, and we just start enumerating possible programs in order, what they do. When you can think of this as kind of like, it's like something a bit zoological. It's like what are all these creatures which are made from these particular very simple genetic code type things, what do they do? And you might argue, you might imagine that if the program that makes them is very simple, then the things it makes will be correspondingly simple. But actually, if you look at this as kind of an example of a computer experiment, kind of empirical science of the computational universe, then you see, for example, rule number 30 there, my all-time favorite, started off running, there it is, starting just with a single black cell at the top, and running for a few steps. And what you see is it seems kind of complicated what it does. If you run it a bit longer, you see something really quite elaborate. You can see a certain amount of regularity over on the left. But in many respects, this pattern, this picture looks completely random. If you look at the center column of cells here, it actually is a very good source of randomness. So this is a really weird thing. It's something that is not what one's intuition might make one expect to happen. One might think, okay, there's a simple rule that will have simple behavior. One might think, if you want to get a picture like this, you're going to have to go to a lot of effort. You're not going to be able to just effortlessly get a pattern as complicated as this. But in fact, it turns out that in this computational universe of possible programs, it's really common to find really simple programs that have really complicated behavior. So one of the things that I got very interested in 30-something years ago when I first saw this was, okay, maybe that's how nature does this kind of thing. Because in nature, we very often see very elaborate patterns of behavior and so on, and we ask the question, how did nature achieve that pattern? How did nature get to the point of being able to do this? And we always imagined it must be something very complicated that did that. And there were explanations in, for example, biology for a long time, and then people said, oh, well, at least there's biological evolution. We must have gone through all these efforts and steps of evolution to get to where we are. But actually, it isn't really true. In fact, if you just pick programs just at random, this computational universe of possible programs, it's really common to get patterns that are really complicated like this. And in fact, if you look in biology, I've done an example here. If you look in biology, it's really not uncommon. Here's a nice example. There's a type of mollusk shell that actually produces a pattern that is very much like the pattern that I just showed you in that cellular chromosome. In fact, it has a line of cells that are at the growing lip of the shell there that actually work more or less like the rules of the cellular automaton and produce that kind of behavior. So the question is, when we see this, what we're seeing here, I view this as being really a sort of a paradigm-breaking phenomenon. This phenomenon within the computational universe, there's all this richness of possible behavior. And this is something that I think is sort of critical in understanding how the natural world works. It's also something that's critical in showing us what's possible in technology. And just as when we think about technology, mechanical technology and so on, we imagine that we're going to go out into the physical universe and go and find, iron and material, discover this magnetic and make all kinds of magnetic things, or we're going to discover liquid crystals and use that to make liquid crystal displays and so on. So here in the computational universe, there's a sort of infinite collection of possible things to discover, and the question is, can we sort of lasso those things and use them for our technological purposes? So, for example, I mentioned this particular thing, Rule 30, actually we used it for many years as a source of pseudo-random numbers. Actually, we recently retired it as a default source of random numbers because we've done more efficient kind of program. But it is something which can be kind of pulled in as something to achieve that purpose. I just saw this morning actually an example of a road traffic flow simulation and methodology that was based on, which I can show you what it's based on one of these solar automata, a particular one called, so now I'm going to, if you go in the sort of universe of possible, it's solar automaton 184. Steps 400 here. So this particular solar automaton turns out to be one that is relevant for understanding road traffic flow. I just happened to see this morning an approach to road traffic flow based on this particular rule. It's kind of fun when you can go and you're kind of using what's out there in the computational universe, sort of new raw material to make models of systems in nature, but also make things that will be used in technology. So the way I kind of see it these days, out in the sort of computational universe of possible computations, there's all of this kind of seeding activity of possible computations to be done, and we can kind of characterize how complex these computations are. There's a whole sort of theory behind this that I spent lots of time working on that has to do with trying to explain the comparison between sort of the sophistication of the computations that are happening in systems like these and the sophistication of computations that are happening in things like our brains. And one of the key things of this thing I call the principle of computational equivalence, which is basically the statement that the sophistication of computations that happen even in these very simple cellular automata is just the same as the sophistication of things that happen anyplace else in our universe, whether it's in our brains or in the physics that are going on in the universe. And there are many, we can have a long discussion about what the consequences of that are, both for understanding kind of the nature of intelligence, things, questions about free will, all sorts of interesting philosophy kinds of things, also questions about, I would like to say, the weather has a mind of its own. Does that really make sense? In the sense that there is the same kind of sophistication of computation that's going on in the weather as in one of these simple cellular automata, as in our brains. We can have sort of a new interpretation of that kind of thing. There's a lot to say about the interplay between this principle of computational equivalence and things like undecidability and Gödel's theorem and so on. Basically, this principle of computational equivalence talks about the ubiquity of sophisticated computation. So it says For example, here's a very simple cell automaton that turns out to be as computationally sophisticated as anything. You know, it's a universal computer, we know even beyond that, but it ubiquitously produces sophisticated computations. If we ask questions like, what will happen to this process of evolution in the end? What will happen after an arbitrarily long time? That would be a general question that we can't answer much more efficiently than just by running the steps in that computation, what I call computationally irreducible. And this phenomenon of computational irreducibility is a kind of sharper version of undecidability, Gödel's theorem, and so on. It has lots of other implications for understanding the foundations of mathematics, for example, and understanding questions about why is mathematics doable? Why does it turn out to be the case that most of the mathematics that people try to do is actually something where you can decide the answer, where you don't run into sort of irreducible phenomena and undecidability. Did I just lose you guys?
No.
Oh, there we go with that. So the thing, my sort of current view of these things is so there's this kind of very powerful ocean of computation that's out there in the computational universe. The problem for us is how do we humans sort of communicate with that ocean of computation and get it to do things that are useful to us? And I guess I've spent the last about 35 years of my life working on that problem. I've spent a lot of time working on sort of what's out there in this kind of computation universe, and also on how do we communicate with it? What do we do to how do we talk to this sort of these entities in the computational universe? And then, so what I realized is that we need a kind of language, a computational communication language that allows us to tell our computers what to do. So this is something that I spent a long time building. This is what we call working language, and it does many kinds of things. You could do something very trivial, then we could say, okay, let me generate some random graph with might be some social network or something. I could say, show me, communities in that random graph. And kind of the idea here is that we are what we try to do is what one also does in human language. We try to take sort of all of the computational ideas and the ideas which are of repeated importance. We basically made them words or primitives of this language, and we can use these words to sort of communicate about what's possible. So, for example, I could say, in this language, I could say New York City, and it will understand, okay, there's this thing called New York City, and let's say, for example, I want to make let's do this, let's make a geographic picture of, let's say, New York, I want to make a disk around the center of New York City with a radius of, let's say, 10 miles, and then let me now show what, I realize this poor computer line, okay, there we go. So there's a picture of a map of New York City. Let's say, for example, I want to make this more of a program. I want to say, show me powers of 10 numbers of miles around the center of New York City, make a table of those with n going from, let's say, 0 to about 4 there. So let's say, okay, so now that will show us so this sequence of zoomed out pictures, and eventually we'll be seeing most of the Earth with a small gap in the southern Indian Ocean. So this is now our language trying to represent kind of a computational idea in the cleanest form we can. So we can do all kinds of things. We could say something like, I don't know, let's do something different. Let's say countries in Europe. Just as another, so one of the things that's notable about Vulkan language is that it can talk about real things in the world. It's not just dealing with abstract concepts, it's actually dealing with real things in the world. So, for example, there will be a list of countries in Europe, and we could, for example, say, show us images of the flags of all those countries. Let's do that. Okay, there we go. And now we could say, for example, let's take those flags and let's make a feature space plot. Let's use modern machine learning methods to figure out, which flags are kind of like which other flags. So we'll see there using some set of features that it's learned, it's grouped these flags together. And so that's kind of again, we could then say, for example, there's another kind of thing we can do. We could say, we could take one of these flags and let's take that flag, whatever that one is, let's take it up here. We can go ahead and we can use that as an image, and we could say, let's edge detect that image, and we could go and do computations on it and so on. We can let's do this. Let's say we want, how about, we'll say, first of all, let's say, your nearest, let us find out the nearest mountain to New York City. I don't know what people think that is, but let's say the 5 nearest mountains to New York City. So now we're going to do a different kind of computation. Okay, I don't know what these are. Let's try that one now. And let's say we want the geo-elevation data of a geodisc of, let's say, 2 miles around that mountain. And we should be able to get elevation data. Let's say we want to make a plot. So let's make a 3D plot of that. Yeah, let's just go ahead and do that. So now this should make a plot. There we go. So there's the topography of that particular mountain, wherever that is. And we can, for example, take that plot, and for example, we could say, for that, we could, for example, say, print out 3D, and then if I had a 3D printer attached to the computer, let's see, we can do something like this. Let's try that. So this will probably go and try and okay. I didn't keep the right thing. But anyway, this would have been able to generate 3D printing from this elevation plot of this particular region on the Earth. So we can go ahead and say something like, let's pick something that's more. Let's just get a picture. Let's say a picture of, what's the favorite kind of animal? We'll have a picture of an anteater. And let's see whether, so what this is now doing, it's interpreted that question in a precise form as a piece of language code. So it went from natural language to code, and then it's using its curated knowledge base to get us this picture, which I guess is a picture of an anteater. Now let's do something else. Let's do the inverse of that. Let's try to use modern machine learning. Let's feed that to image identify, and let's see whether we can identify what this is a picture of. And so now it will be probably loading up some big neural network, and then saying, okay, so it's a giant anteater. If we wanted to, we could actually see how to figure that out. We could say, show us the net model that it uses for image identify. And this is now, okay, so this is a whole big network that has all these various graphs and all kinds of other elaborate things. We could say, here, if we take that network, line 20, there, and feed it an anteater here, we can, we'll see that will tell us it's a giant anteater. What we could also do is to say, well, how did you figure out it's a giant anteater? So we could just take only part of the network. Just take, let's say, the first 8 levels in that network, feed those the giant anteater, and it's going to give us probably some big messy output that will be kind of the intermediate stages in this particular sort of artificial neural network's way of figuring out that this is a picture of a giant anteater. So what's sort of interesting about this is when we think about what's happening inside the neural network, it's the same kind of thing as what's happening out there in the sort of computational universe of possible program. What happened was this particular neural net was trained to identify images. It was of all the possible programs that this neural net could have been running, it was trained to be the particular program that was useful for our purposes and actually identifies the kinds of things that we have names for. If we look inside sort of what computation is going on, it's hard for us to understand this computation because many of the distinctions that it's making are things for which we don't have names, for which we don't have. There could be a word for the particular distinction made by this particular layer in the neural network and so on. We could say it's a, is the picture globulous or not globulous or something. And that may be a useful distinction in understanding the world, but it doesn't have to be one that has sort of socially arisen language that we use. Actually, an interesting example of that kind of question of sort of how things socially arise in languages, and let me show you something. So I worked many years ago now on Boolean algebra, and I was interested in figuring out what the simplest axiom system for Boolean algebra is. Let's see if I can get it up here. There it is. It must be somewhere here. I'm sure it's somewhere here. Let's see if I can find it. And there we go. Okay, so let me show you something. It's a new thing that we can do. So this is asking. So that's my little axiom system right there. That simple axiom system turns out to be is the simplest axiom system for Boolean algebra. People have been looking for this for a while. I managed to actually find it 20 years ago or so now. What we can do now is we can say, okay, so let's try to prove that axiom system. What I'm going to do here, I'm not going to prove this all of algebra. I'm going to prove that this axiom system by distribution and operator, which is just one piece of proving this is the same as Boolean algebra. So what we're going to get out is this thing that we can represent here. Let's say this is 25. Let's say proof network. What this is going to be, network. This is the new feature. So proof graph. Okay. So this shows essentially the interdependence of lemmas in the proof of this theorem. So we're going from the axiom, and then it's going through, and it's got a bunch of different lemmas here, and it's eventually going to prove the result. So we can go ahead and show, I can show you 125, and then I can say proof data set. And this is now going to generate essentially a manifest, a description of that proof. The most interesting thing about this proof is it isn't interesting. In the following sense, this proof is completely incomprehensible to humans. I've tried different times over the last few years to try to understand this proof, the machine-generated proof. I've completely failed. So what does this tell us? What's interesting about this is that if this were a proof that was sort of written down in a textbook, it would be, well, actually, let me say another thing. When it's a question of what is a proof? Proof is an attempt to explain to a human why something is true. So, for example, in one of our businesses, Wolf Alpha, we used pretty universally by the students of the world to do things like math. And so, for example, you might say, what's the integral of x squared sine x? And Wolf Alpha will very quickly show us there's the answer and tell us all kinds of other interesting things about it. But it turns out what students often like is to be able to say, well, why is that true? And to know why it's true, you have to be able to generate a bunch of steps. And this is now showing us, that's the point. This was too easy. I should have given you a more difficult computation, but let's give it let's just give it a more difficult computation here. So in any case, what we're doing here is essentially to show. So very quickly, spoken language figured out what the answer to that computation was. It takes a little bit more effort to show something which has been constructed for humans to explain to humans why that's the right answer. And so here there'll be a whole bunch of different steps that go through to get us to the answer that somebody writes down for homework or whatever. But what's happening here as we explain these steps is that we're kind of using the fact that there's a whole cultural history to every one of these different things that's going on here. And so for example, when we're dealing with this kind of random piece of math that's out there in this sort of computational universe of possible math, we don't have the same cultural anchors. This particular, substitution lemma 2 is this interesting fact here. But that interesting fact wasn't written down by Gauss or Euler. It doesn't have a long history, it doesn't have a name. It's just some random fact that's out there in the space of mathematical facts. And so what we realize is, when we think about construction, for example, construction mathematics, what is happening in construction mathematics is that we are getting to these various waypoints that we then end up having a lot of sort of intellectual structure built around them, and we give those things names, and we understand those, and we go on and build more mathematics from that. It's the same kind of thing as when we build up human language, when we have a set of ideas and concepts that are going on in the world, and at some point those concepts become common and important enough that we start giving them names, and then we can reason in terms of those concepts and build up from there. And what we're seeing in this, in the sense what somebody like me does with design computer languages does, is to try to take all those sort of computational concepts and figure out which are the important sort of concentration points among those concepts and give those names and then implement them in the language. And that's kind of what I see as being this bridge between human thinking and sort of the raw computational universe. And I see it as being kind of that's sort of a key thing we have to do right now, is to learn, we have this sort of AI and so on as this very powerful thing that can make use of this computational universe and possible programming and so on. The question is, how do we communicate with that? How do we make this bridge between what we think about as humans, the particular things that we think about as humans, and the things that we can get the computational universe to do for us? And there is much that goes on in the computational universe that we as humans don't have a lot to say about. And when you look at a picture like this, and you ask the question, what's going on in this picture? Well, we could start describing everything. You say, do we care about this picture? I don't know. It's, we might have some application of what happened in this picture. It might be some piece of decorative art. It might be something that's really useful for some hashing algorithm or something. Or it might just be some random thing that's happening out there in the computational universe. So this is this question of how do we sort of, this interplay between what is possible in the computational universe, what we think about, what we humans have sort of developed in the history of our civilization, of ways to think about, and then what we can, and so there's sort of this funny spiral that one understands happens. So there's sort of what's possible in the computational universe, what's possible in the natural world. Those two are somewhat related. There's what we then draw onto and choose to understand and make use of, and then we build our sort of environment, and we build things in engineering and technology and so on around what we have understood. And given those things that we've built and understood, we can then go to sort of the next level and see what's sort of the next thing that we care about is. And so I've sort of been interested in what this means for kind of the arc of human history and technology and so on. It's like at this point, we are able to take a lot of things that we humans used to have to do ourselves, and we can automate those. And the question is, what I'm sort of saying is that in the computational universe, there's sort of an infinite collection of things that can be done automatically. The main question is not what can be done, but what are those things out there that we care about doing. And what we care about is something that is very much intertwined with the history of our civilization, our culture, and so on. And so it's really an interesting issue of, we try to think about, the evolution of for example, human purposes. So, for example, one question would be, okay, if the world is run by AIs, what will the world choose to do? I don't think that's a well-formed question. The phenomenon of this principle of computational equivalence kind of shows us that there's computation going on everywhere, whether it's going on in our brains, whether it's going on in the weather, whether it's going on elsewhere. And all these different computations are actually equivalent in their sophistication. But the ones that go on in our brains, the ones that we have this cultural connection to, and we understand what the point of them is. When we look at the weather and say, what is the weather trying to achieve? What is its goal? We can't really answer that. This is really a very meaningful question for us. So one of the things that's a question is, when we make AI, the AI is doing all sorts of things that are possible in the computational universe. The question is, what is the AI trying to do? Well, that's something that in and of itself, but in the abstract, isn't really a meaningful question. And I think what we realize is when people say, well, all the jobs in the world are going to go away, there's not really anything for humans to do. The thing that almost by definition humans still get to do is to say what should be done. That is, it's all very good to have a machine, technology that automates the doing of things. But the question of what should you choose to do, what is the goal, is something that almost by definition is not ordinable. There is no perfect goal. There is no sort of limiting goal that's the perfect goal of every possible thing. That's something that is defined purely by our sort of civilization and culture and so on. So the thing that I've sort of been interested in is in this kind of art of, as we ask, what is the evolution of human purposes? What is, what is the, how does something like evolve? How do we think about the evolution of human purposes? One of the things that we think about is the distant future and kind of, the world where human consciousness can all be nicely uploaded in some digital form. And, my vision of this is kind of we end up with the trillion souls in a box type thing. When we have this kind of box of trillion souls, the most natural possibility for what will these trillion souls be doing is basically playing video games for the rest of eternity, which to us today seems like a really bad outcome for the future of history. But the thing to realize is I have become less pessimistic thinking about that. When you think back, let's say 1,000 years and you ask, what did people think was the purpose of things 1,000 years ago? And what would they think of the things we do today? And the fact that I walked on a treadmill for some amount of time today, try explaining that to a person from 1,000 years ago. It's something which, given our current cultural beliefs and history and so on, is explainable, but 1,000 years ago, that's not a very explainable purpose. Or, getting the longest possible streak in Snapchat. Again, it's very hard to explain purpose to somebody from 1,000 years ago. I think what one starts to realize is that as we evolve towards the future, the human purposes evolve based on sort of the ambient technology that we have available. And we can see that. We can, our sort of modes of thinking evolve, and our purposes evolve too. I mean, a very important way modes of thinking evolve is this idea of computational thinking, which is, I think, the sort of emerging paradigm today, gives one very different ways to think about the world than traditional methods of logical thinking or mathematical thinking or whatever else. And computational thinking is both at a practical level sort of revolutionizing many kinds of fields, but it's also giving us a different way to think about what we choose to do and how we think about ourselves and so on. And I think that the thing that we have to realize is that as it sort of builds in layers, so as one understands more, one builds more things, one builds more technology, that technology makes possible new purposes that didn't make any sense before, and we can keep building from that. It's even related, for example, things like education. The question is, what should we teach people at any given time in history? So, for example, most of us probably didn't learn how to match points, which would have been a really useful skill, 50,000 years ago or something in history. But we don't really know what's happening anymore because the things that don't happen made possible have been long ago automated in the history of technology. For somebody like me, I just missed the time when humans learned to take experiments by hand. That's and I also missed, knowing how to make a quill pen with a feather. So there are these things that get automated away. And so we build these layers. And I think that actually, it's a question I don't know the answer to, is whether the frontier of what is worth teaching and how many concepts need to be taught humans has remained more or less constant in the course of human history, just as the number of words and languages has remained more or less constant. Some go out of style, others come in. But in any case, the thing to think about is how does all of this relate to sort of the evolution of human purposes, the way that we build technology that then allows new purposes, the way that we then define purposes that cause us to build new technology that goes going from there and so on. So I think so I suppose I should wrap up here. The thing that I kind of want to maybe describe is a few points. First of all, the intuition that there is this computational universe out there that is very rich and full of all kinds of sophisticated computational processes. That sophisticated computational processes are not hard to find. You don't need to go through the whole of human history and build elaborate computers and so on to get to sophisticated computation. Sophisticated computation is something quite ubiquitous in the computational It's a little bit disappointing to me with all this effort to build all these elaborate computers and so on. It turns out that elaborate computation is really easy to find. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, given all this sophisticated computation that's out there, how does that relate to, well, I mentioned how it relates to science and using it as sort of raw material to make models in science. How does it relate to technology? Well, raw material, it's something you can mine to make technology. You mine this computational universe, you find the things that are useful to us from this computational universe. And then there's the question of how do we actually, in practice, how do we communicate? How do we actually describe? I talked about the importance of humans being able to define purposes, define goals and so on. How do we actually define those goals? And that's what I've spent a large part of my life on, is creating a language which is this bridge between human thinking and providing sort of a language for computational thinking, a way of sort of computational communication language which allows us to communicate what are the goals that we want to get achieved in this computational universe of possible progress. And right now, for example, one coming fraction, I suppose, with this problem of kind of defining a symbolic language to represent ideas and thoughts in the world, it's an old story. I mean, there was a big effort 300 years ago with people like Leibniz to create a kind of symbolic discourse language that could define things that were happening in the world. Leibniz imagined it as a way to kind of settle legal arguments. You just write your legal cases in a kind of symbolic discourse language, and then a machine could decide, well, who was right and who was wrong. Well, for the last 300 years, we haven't really had the either intellectual or practical raw material to build a symbolic discourse language, but we can now do that. And working language has come a pretty decent distance towards having such a symbolic discourse language, and working on trying to get it the last few steps. But some of the things that become possible in today's world, there's a lot of interest in smart contracts. So the self-executing contracts, they often get tied up with blockchain and things. I don't think the blockchain part of it is not the most essential part. The essential part is that, for example, two parties might agree, okay, if this kind of thing happens in the world, then I want this kind of thing to take place. If in fact you successfully deliver fruit of this quality to my loading dock, then you will pay me X amount of money. And if you successfully deliver fruit, in today's world, that's okay. I have a camera looking at that loading dock. I have a machine learning classifier that's grading the kind of fruit that's arriving. I have an IoT sensor that's telling me the weight of the fruit. It all checks out. Then send this number of Bitcoin, or do this credit card billing, or do this bank transfer, and so on. And this idea of being able to represent things about the world well enough that we can actually communicate our intentions in things like these smart contracts is an interesting kind of coming attraction. But what gets more fun once you can do that, first of all, you're doing it between human parties. You're having sort of contracts between human parties that find the intermediate, with this computational communication language as the language in which the contract is written, not legalese, but instead symbolic discourse language. And then you start to get into a more elaborate situation of contracts not between human parties, but between machines and so on. And from there you build a whole different sort of civilization among the machines, where there's sort of the same amount of things that happen in human societies can happen between machines. And then for us, one of the most interesting smart contracts for us is probably the constitution that we have to make up for the AIs to kind of define what it is that we want the AIs to do. For example, we might say, let's have the AIs be nice to humans. We have to actually write in some symbolic discourse language, we have to actually write what that means, which is a difficult thing. Sorry, I should stop there. So, thanks very much. I would love to say something. I know it was impossible, and I know I'm waiting for another week, so.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Wolf? Go ahead.
Dr. Wolf,
Everybody's looking to that side, but I can't see where it's.
why don't you come down and
Jason Ellis is going to ask a question.
We'll make it a little more personal.
Hello.
Hello, Dr. Wolfram. I was wondering, you mentioned Bitcoin in the last bit there. What are some of your thoughts on blockchain technology like Bitcoin and the kinds of work, I guess, that people are using the computational universe for in terms of value, and also maybe in like how it's maybe using resources efficiently in the real world? Any of your thoughts on that?
You know, it's really amusing to me. I invented this idea of computational irreducibility, and I thought, how can this, where will this directly be used? And the idea of Bitcoin mining is a direct computational irreducibility play. It's saying, proof of work is all about, this fact that there is an irreducible computation that's going on, and you're using that irreducible computation. I think it's kind of a hacky method for establishing a system, but nevertheless, that's the case. In terms of what, it's kind of fun to see. You can see, if I just look at, let's do this. Let's look at the most recent block on Bitcoin blockchain. Let's see if we can do that. Blockchain-based Bitcoin. And we can start to see, okay, so that's the most recent block on the Bitcoin blockchain, not so many transactions actually there. And we could go and let's pick one of the transactions. Let's just pick that transaction, whatever it is. And so we can ask. So now I'm going to show you something. Maybe maybe I should pick the Ethereum blockchain because it has slightly richer stuff on it. But let's try blockchain transaction data. So somewhere here, if I drill down, there will be, fascinating. That's fascinating. Well, that's very interesting. So that may be a transaction that didn't make it onto the consensus blockchain. Well, who knows? But anyway, so I'm going to show you that you can actually look at the script that's being run on the Bitcoin blockchain. I view, okay, so how do I actually think about these things? The first point is that in terms of smart contracts, I think that the vast majority of interesting smart contracts do not require blockchains. That is, the vast majority of smart contracts are for $20. You say, will you water my plants every day when it's raining? Right? And there's a sensor in the plant, and it's measuring the moisture. Then it's using the global weather data that we have and so on. That contract, yes, it's amusing to put the data on a blockchain and whether the person showed up to water the plant, but nobody cares. Not for $20. In the case of, I think, commission blockchains between large financial institutions and things, supply chain blockchains and so on, those will make a lot of sense. I think the things that I view the public blockchain as being basically just one source of certainty in what happens in the transaction. Another source of certainty, we have actually a private blockchain that we'll soon be releasing, where you can just go put random stuff on our private blockchain. And that blockchain, most likely what we'll end up doing is publishing a hash in that private blockchain every week in some random newspaper. So if somebody says, did this really happen? You can say, go to any public library, go find this newspaper, and go look at the hash, and you can check if it happened. And, if somebody really needs for some legal purpose to show it happened, that's probably absolutely good enough. And you don't need a public blockchain with a large number of copies of the blockchain out in the world to establish that. Now, I think that, what my guess is that smart contracts will be a hierarchy of kinds of certainty from just, I basically trust the executor of the smart contracts through it's on a private blockchain that's being, where the hash of the blockchain is being published in the newspaper, through it's on a public blockchain like Bitcoin, for example, through then after that there's an arbitration clause in the smart contract that says if things go really bad, we'll pay some humans to go figure out what happened, through probably to a very interesting business for the insurance companies, which is to be insured of smart contracts, but there's actually something that's ultimately an insurance company that's ensuring the outcome of the transaction. But in terms of what do I see happening as a result of these kinds of things, what will happen is that the cost of making a contract will dramatically decrease. And there will be many more contracts and many more, much more trivial things than we see them today. And it will be a routine thing that people will be, it's a very simple everyday kind of task. Like, somebody will say, okay, I want to, I'm thinking of going to the park, and I want to let me buy, somebody has, you buy weather insurance because it's trivial to do that. It would be if you had to go to the whole rigmarole to do it, you would do it, but that means you can greatly increase the set of things and once that's been done so where there's a human in the loop, then you get to do it when there are not humans directly in the loop, and where you have bots that are basically trying to make a living for themselves in the world, so to speak, in a fairly autonomous way. And I think the really interesting question, but I don't know how it's going to play out, is the kind of the society of the AIs that gets created by these kinds of things that somehow is attached to human society, peripherally, internally, all kinds of interesting things are going on that I don't really understand. So.
Are there any other questions? We have another question.
Good afternoon, Dr. Wolfram. So I was particularly struck, you made a statement about the proof of the Boolean theorem and how you were unable to explain it. And I was wondering if you might be able to comment on the fact that Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, which goes into effect in 2018 in Article 22, indicates that EU citizens can contest legal or similarly significant decisions made by algorithms and appeal for human intervention. It seems to me that there may be a contradiction here in the fact that we're asking for an explanation about a process that may not be explainable to humans. I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's really interesting and kind of fun, actually, because, yes, that statement is completely stupid at some level. In other words, the idea that things would have a human explanation it's not clear that's true. I mean, if you ask, for example, science has been about, much of science, natural science, has been about taking what happens in the natural world and trying to find human understandable explanations of what's going on in the natural world. Science is hard. But we've got an affair discussion in science. There are things we don't know in science. It is not obvious that there always is a useful science of everything. So, for example, computational reproducibility, we take a picture like this, and we say, what's going on in this picture? Now, explain, okay, you say to some, legislator, some regulator in the EU, you say, why does that particular vertical street, happen? And obviously, at some level, the answer is, you just follow through the rules and you can see explicitly what happens. If you say, well, really, why do you have to explain it to me? There may not be a human level explanation of it. So, for example, one interesting question, you look at different areas of science, like linguistics is a good area to think about. Linguistics, you ask the question, is there a science of linguistics? Even if at some point we understand every neuron in the brain, we can explain how every neuron firing happens the way it happens, it is not obvious that from that we will be able to derive the science of linguistics. As it might be the case, we can say, there's 100 billion neurons in the brain, and they follow these rules, and we can go, neuron follows neuron, and out eventually you say the word, elephant or something. But you say, well, why did that happen? And we might have no story to tell about why that happens. So I think the idea that there's a human story to be told about what is going on in the computational universe is simply wrong. And in fact, it's something we've kind of known is wrong now since Gödel's theorem and things like this. Although it hasn't been as in your face as it now is starting to be. And people ask, when you look at, let's say, neural networks, and you say, why did you do that? Well, there's a fake story, or there's a story that says, well, you can follow through all these million operations, and you can see that it came out an answer. But the why, from the point of view of the story, there may just not be a story to tell. And I think, the way that we go on, suspect, in the legal setting is, you're trying to convince the jury of something. Can you tell them the story? Maybe not. You can say, okay, jury, you can go and then what will end up happening is actually it's kind of this idea of computational reproducibility, and this idea that you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen except by explicitly following each step, that idea I started talking about 30 years ago now, and it's kind of amusing because for a while I used to get all these requests to be an expert witness for, and I never did any of these. It would have been kind of interesting to do one just because, you know, it's like, it's the how could we have known that this would happen question. By the way, I think a lot of what I'm talking about, computational reproducibility and so on, it also relates to things like computer security, because basically what makes computer systems insecure is fundamentally you don't know everything about how they will behave. And as soon as you have a system that has reached the threshold of computational reproducibility, you have a system where you can't always predict what it will do. And that's the place where there is a potential for exploiting the system and so on, making it do something you didn't expect or want. All right, I am super late for something else I'm supposed to do. I might be able to go, if you're going to have a panel, I might be able to join that technically can work.
Our heartfelt thanks, and I also thank the David Smith for the question. I really appreciate you accommodating us. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Right.
So I'd like to introduce our next and final speaker for the evening before the panel. Tony Hey began his career as a theoretical physicist with a doctorate in particle physics from the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. After a career in physics that included research positions at Caltech and CERN and a professorship at the University of Southampton in England, he became interested in parallel computing and moved into computer science. After being both head of department and dean of engineering at Southampton, Tony Hey was appointed to lead the UK's groundbreaking eScience initiative in 2001. A little higher. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Smith. He recognized the importance of big data for science and wrote one of the first papers on the data deluge in 2003. He joined Microsoft in 2005 as a vice president and was responsible for Microsoft's global university research engagements. He returned to the UK in November 2015 and is now chief data scientist at the Science and Technology Facilities Council. In 1987, Tony Hey was asked by Caltech Nobel physicist Richard Feynman to write up his lectures on computation. This covered such unconventional topics as the thermodynamics of computing, as well as an outline for a quantum computer. Feynman's introduction to the workings of a computer in terms of the actions of a so-called dumb file clerk was the inspiration for Tony Hey's attempt to write The Computing Universe, a popular book about computer science. Tony Hey is a fellow of the AAAS and of the UK's Royal Academy of Engineering. In 2005, he was awarded a CPE by Prince Charles for his services to science. Let us all welcome Tony Hey.
Well, it's great to be here, and I was extremely surprised to receive the invitation and to find that they've been using my book as a course book, so I'm deeply grateful for that. But it was intended to look at the history and the cultural history, if you like, of computing, and also to say how we got where we are now, and where we're going in the future. So that was the intent of the book. And what I'm doing now is related to that, and if I have time, I'll say a few words at the end. But let's move on. Okay, so at Microsoft Research, there's several Turing Award winners, one of whom is Butler Lamson, and so he talks about the third age of computing, which, let's see if I can see the screen, yes. Okay, and roughly every 30 years, so from about 1950 to 1980, computers were used for calculating things like aerodynamics of aeroplanes and nuclear bombs and things like that, as well as Excel spreadsheets. But then we invented the internet and the web, and in the next age, 30 years or so, were the age of communication, and that was what Butler called the second age of computing. And where he thinks we are now is in what he called embodiment, which I would translate as getting computers to do things that are useful to us. So, for example, I was with my son and he was at the local supermarket with me in his Volkswagen car. When we got back, it was quite difficult to park and he had to parallel park, so he said, "What's this, Dad?" and said, you know, press the button and the car parked itself. And that's exactly what you'd like from an intelligent system. It does the parallel parking. But I also came across a colleague of mine at Berkeley Lab in California, was driving to another lab, the Livermore Laboratory, 30 miles south, and he took a laboratory car. When he arrived and saw his boss there, his boss said, I'm very sorry, Horst, but I'm going to have to report you for speeding. And he said, but I wasn't stopped. Nobody stopped me. No, the car reported him. So there are also upsides and downsides, and I'll try and illustrate that as we go along. So what I'd like to do is do a very lightning quick survey of how we got where we are, and then talk about the sort of issues that other speakers have talked about. So, first of all then, here's Gordon Moore. He was the founder of Intel, and he came up with Moore's Law, and it was based on extrapolating this figure. He noticed the number of components you could get on an integrated circuit was doubling roughly every year, and he predicted this could go on for the next 50 years. And as you can see, he's pretty well correct. We now have billions of transistors on a chip, and it all came from this. This is the Intel first microprocessor, the 4004 in 1971. An engineer named Ted Hoff at Intel was asked by a Japanese company to make a series of calculators, and they wanted chips for each one, which was successively more powerful. But he and his colleagues thought, well, that's a bit stupid. Why don't we make one chip which we can then program with different capabilities? And that was the beginning of the idea of the microprocessor. And this chip had about 2,000 transistors. Moving on, 2016, this was roughly the state of the art, and this has more than 3 billion transistors on the same chip. So this is an Intel Xeon chip. Okay, so we've really made progress in the sense of technology, in building engineering chips and so on. And the first age of computing started just about the end of the Second World War, and this was the first machine that was built. It was the ENIAC in 1945. It was 8 feet high, 80 feet long, weighed 30 tons, and had about 18,000 vacuum tubes in it. Right. The reason I want to show it here is to emphasize some unsung heroes who've lately been awarded to the Computing Hall of Fame, and it's these people here. These were the programmers, and it's interesting that both here with the ENIAC and with the Cambridge computer in England, which was the first working stored memory computer, the programmers were women mainly, and not so many electrical engineers, but the programmers were women, and they were largely forgotten. But now they've been recognized, their contribution. And on the left here is Maudsley and Eckert, a physicist and an engineer who pioneered that. Okay, moving on. In the 60s, we had this corporate idea. You couldn't actually use the machine yourself. You gave it to an operator who put them in, and it was all very much a clinical thing. It was like a holy temple. You handed your program to the operator who put it in, and so on. But what was interesting was that the companies and the computing departments in universities did not make the breakthrough that came here. This was made by a bunch of hobbyists. This was by people who had not got university degrees, who were not in computer science departments, who were not, by and large, in computing companies. Here is the young Bill Gates, here with Paul Allen, and this is Microsoft, and they wrote the first programming language, BASIC compiler, for the first do-it-yourself computer chip. And then this is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak with Apple, what you had to do at the beginning was go and build your own. You got the kit, and you had to build the box yourself and so on. This was the first Apple computer. What Steve Jobs realized that people didn't want to do that mostly. They wanted actually to have it already done for them and packaged up in a beautifully designed box, and that was Steve Jobs. And based on the work that was done actually at a commercial lab called Xerox PARC in 1970. It was founded by Xerox, who recognized that copying wasn't perhaps the business they needed to be in all the time. And it was people like Bob Taylor, Chuck Thacker, Butler Lampson, with Alan Kay and Adele Goldberg, who invented essentially everything we have around us, the whole WIMP interface, windows, icons, mouse, and pointing devices, the Alto computer they built then, and it was ridiculously expensive. But Butler Lampson and Chuck Thacker, the two technologists who built it, understood Moore's law. So it was ridiculously expensive in the early 70s, but because of Moore's law, it would be cheap enough for everybody to have one. So this was the first personal computer, and it's remarkable what the Xerox PARC lab put together. They put together not only the WIMP interface, they had the first WYSIWYG word processor, which, if you like, was the killer app for that lab. And they also had an Ethernet connecting them and a laser printer. So they really had most of the modern apparatus that we see around us today. They only missed the spreadsheet and, of course, PowerPoint. I was going to tell a story about Stephen Wolfram. I'm sorry he's not here at this moment. I'll remind him when I next see him. But when I was at Caltech, when he was a student there, he never finished his degree, his qualifications at Eton. He never finished his degree at Oxford. He went to Caltech and finally got a degree at Caltech, and that's when I came across him. And we used to be, I remember playing a video game at 2 o'clock in the morning and getting a note from Stephen saying, "Stop wasting computer time," at 2 o'clock in the morning. So nowadays, of course, it's not a thing done by grad students and people early in the morning illegally. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry, and this was one of the first games, and this actually had the distinction of appealing to both sexes as opposed to the shoot-'em-out games which largely appeal to males. Okay, so that was the first stage of computing, if you like. The second age was when we connected together, and I was asked who are the 3 most important people in the story of computing, and I cheated. I said Gates and Jobs, because they gave us everything. They democratized computing for the world by making these cheap PCs and Macintoshes and so on. And then the person who had the idea for connecting them was a psychology professor from MIT called J.C.R. Licklider. And interestingly, as Scott said, IA instead of AI, intelligent assistance as opposed to artificial intelligence. And that was actually Licklider's view. He wrote a wonderful paper called A Human-Computer Symbiosis, which was of how augmenting human intelligence with the computer. And I think that's a much more credible view of the future than a full AI view, which was, of course, the view at MIT with McCarthy and Minsky at the time. So this was the internet at an early stage. It was actually called the ARPANET. It was funded by ARPA, now DARPA, and it connected the major universities in the US. It also connected over here to UCL in London, and I remember connecting up from UCL to Caltech over here via the ARPANET. And then, what was the killer application? It was thought that you would actually have rare, expensive computers at each of these sites, and you could share them rather than everybody buying a very expensive computer. But of course, the killer app was actually just email. We could do it on the computer. At one site, you could send messages to people on the same computer, and what this guy, engineer Ray Tomlinson, did was actually realize that you could use the internet and send the message over the internet to another computer. And that was the beginning of email. And this is a representation of what the internet looks now. So this was actually a network of networks where they can all communicate, and we can now send messages all over the world. However, the next advance was prefigured by another MIT professor called Vannevar Bush, who invented an analog computer before the war, but also during the war he tried to convince Roosevelt that science could actually help the war effort, and so he was appointed by Roosevelt to lead the National Research Committee, which oversaw all the projects like radar and so on, and also the Manhattan Project for nuclear weapons. And after the war, he wrote a couple of papers, one of which was called The Endless Frontier, which led to the founding of NSF. It was about, you know, the government funding science for research benefits for the whole nation. And the other one was a paper called As We May Think. And in 1945, he envisaged that there was so much being published now that was so complicated for some person to know everything in detail of all the fields, like the great scientists of the past. And he envisaged that you'd have to follow people, experts who knew the field, and in order to find out things at the frontier of that field, you followed their trails through this literature. And this led, it inspired both Ted Nelson to invent the idea of hypertext, that you go from this document to this document to this document on a single computer, and Ted Nelson and Doug Engelbart, who invented the mouse, which was another device to enable you to track through this. And what Tim Berners-Lee did was, of course, just like Ray Tomlinson, he put the idea of hypertext with the internet, is you can trace documents on a single computer, but you can also go from this document to a document on another computer. And that simple invention actually has transformed the world and made the actual world that we now all have access to enormous amounts of information really easily, and that was the result of Tim Berners-Lee. And of course then, the next problem when all this information is out there is finding what's there. And in those days, I used to use a search engine called Alta Vista. And these guys, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, were students at Stanford, and they had, Larry Page's father was an academic, and he understood citation impact papers. So if your paper is cited by a Nobel Prize winner, you feel pretty good, and that citation encourages other people to cite it because it's recognized by that person who is significant as being a significant paper. So in addition to counting the number of citations you get, the person who the citation comes from is important. And that led to this idea of PageRank, where you have the number of links as opposed to the number of words on a page. The actual keywords was how Alta Vista worked. This was actually looking at the link structure. And they had this algorithm, and it worked very well around the Stanford campus. And then they tried to sell it. They tried first to sell it to Alta Vista, which was owned by a company which you may remember called DEC. They no longer exist, right? And they said, no, we don't want it. And so they then tried to sell it to a second company of Stanford startup company. It was called Yahoo, and it's founded by David Filo and Jerry Yang. And they said, no, we don't want it either. But David Filo said, well, actually, when we were starting up Yahoo, why don't you start your own company? Okay, well, they did. And then, of course, other things happened. When you have search engines, you have also this phenomenon of social computing. And this is actually now a very significant activity, and it's really going to be involve much analysis, and it's transforming our world as we speak. I'm not sure it's transforming it for the best, but it is transforming it. And those of you who haven't seen the movie The Circle, I do recommend you have a look at The Circle. Okay, so along with good things come bad things, and this is a thing from Microsoft's Digital Crime Unit. This is a picture of their giant screen looking at one particular malware, the botnet malware, and it's a particular one. And you can see from the colours which countries are infested. So Spain and Mexico look in bad shape, all right? They almost 25% of their machines are infected. Up in the USA, you're not doing too good here. Canada's doing great, but of course nobody lives there, so that would be okay. And you can see the rest of the world, and really in Saudi Arabia and the Arab world, it's not so great either. Similarly, down in Brazil. So these are the infections. This is your machine has been taken over by malware and can be used to send spam or can be used to pick up your email. This is something that you do need to worry about. Okay, so where are we now? Well, we're now at the third age where we're actually wanting computers to do things that are useful to us. Computers for embodiment. So here is the example of cars. You can buy a high-end car, Mercedes or BMW or now US and Japanese cars, and they have all this technology around. They can sense a car to the side of them, in front of them. They can tell the difference between a building, a person, and a car, and things like this from the systems. And in principle, they can make car driving much safer because they can brake. Even if you don't brake in time, they can do that for you. So that's the sort of thing you want. And some of the technologies, the machine learning algorithms, where they learn from experience and get better the more things they see. And this is one of the popular ones. This started many years ago, artificial neural networks. It's very loosely based on the idea of our neurons being connected and the synapses and so on. So this is the input layer, and this is the output layer. And you have an input and you have a desired output, and you adjust the weights and the strengths of these connections until you keep feeding back. You have an algorithm which is called a back propagation, which starts how far away you are from the desired solution and then corrects it until you get a very good solution. So you have number plate recognition, which is why you get a speeding ticket and so on, even if you weren't stopped by a car and so on, by a cop. Okay, so this is one example of machine learning. There are many others. This is, however, the one that's extremely popular at the moment. And why is it extremely popular? This is one example. This is an example of natural language processing, understanding speech. So this is called a switchboard test. So it's actually specific vocabulary used by a switchboard operator. It's a very limited text. But you see the number of word error rates was very high in the early days from your computer. But then from 2000, it was sort of plateaued around 30%, whereas humans are around less than 5%, that sort of range. And you see nothing happened until these deep neural networks came along, and now you're getting 6.3% was achieved in 2016. So you're getting close to human error rates. So you're approaching human capabilities for this specific task. And the idea is that they improve with experience, they solve very hard problems, and they can, in principle, extract value from big data. So that's why people are so excited by these things, but I will say something about these later on. Okay, and then we all know now, this is from the Master Chief in the Xbox game with his machine intelligence, Cortana, and you can speak into your machine. Your smartphone can be an iPhone, talk to Siri. Here I talk, because this is a relic, this is a historic relic, this is a Windows phone, right? Not many of these around now. And I can speak to Cortana, and I can ask her, Cortana, open the pod bay doors, and she will reply, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that, or some nerdy joke. This is a joke coming from 2001. But the interesting thing is that processing, it's understood what I've said, and it comes up with a jokey answer in this case, but it didn't come up with serious answers. And what happens is the processing is not done here, it's done up in the cloud. So the amazing thing is that because you can actually go and send the data up to the cloud and get an answer back in less than a second, it really transforms this device, if you like, into a supercomputer. It's really got a huge amount of processing power and knowledge available because it can sit up in the cloud. So the cloud really transforms all these mobile devices into hugely powerful computational devices which can do speech processing, image recognition, and all that sort of stuff. And of course, many of you have an iWatch, Apple Watch, which actually has all these wonderful devices, GPS, and measure your heart rate and all these sort of things. And similarly with Skype, you can now speak into Skype to someone in China. You speak in English, they hear it in Chinese. They speak in Chinese, you hear it in English. You can do these automatic translations. Again, they're not perfect, but they're coming. And that's why people are becoming so excited about AI and machine learning really making exciting progress. And of course, this is the future, the Internet of Things, where you have all this smart infrastructure, consumer, home, healthcare, retail, you name it. In principle, all this is possible. It comes with some dangers, and those are the things that I do think we need to think about. And just to show, on 60 Minutes, there was a video of someone in a car park at the University of Washington. They were driving the car, and the hacker was standing there, and actually he disabled the brakes. And so they put the brakes on, nothing happened, the car went straight on. So these systems can be hacked. Just again, they can give you all these wonderful things you want, but it can also give you lots of problems. Okay. I do want to pick up something Scott talked about, the future of work, and this is the quote from the paper by Frey and Osborne, which I'm not sure how serious you should take. I think it's one data point, and I think it's a little pessimistic. I suspect 47% of total US employment is at risk. But there are some examples. So this is from one of the Brooks, who invented Roomba, was one of the robotics experts at MIT. This is his latest company, the Baxter Company for Industrial Robotics, and it's safe by design. You don't have to program it, you can train it, it learns, it's, as you say, flexible, affordable, adaptive, easily integrated. This is the marketing blurb, but you can see that robotics of this type is clearly going to play a large role in the future and automate lots of jobs. And I could have shown a picture of a Tesla assembly line, which is, mainly a dark hall. They only put the lights on when you're visiting. The lights are not on and just full of robots. This is from the European Truck Platooning Challenge, and the idea, this we can do now. You can have these trucks in convoy. Actually, these trucks all have a driver in, but the drivers here are not actually driving. But by going in convoy, they do some aerodynamics calculations, and they have the distance adjusted so that they actually save gasoline on their trips, and they save, I think it's something like nearly 10% by going in the platoon. And this is perfectly doable right now by not using very advanced AI. This is not autonomous vehicles. On the other hand, this is an autonomous vehicle. This is sort of look up of Google's driverless car, and they have lots of sensors. Obviously, as the computer has batteries and backup systems and so on, and doesn't have a steering wheel or brakes. Now, I'm not sure I like the idea of being in a car without a steering wheel or brakes. But can I show you now a video, if Ilya can help me get we can just pop out of this. And I'll show you a 30-second video of what could happen with driverless cars. Yeah, this is it. Okay. So this is a view of a junction. Cars going across it. And these are driverless cars going across it. Here come the pedestrians. I actually think you have to be a very brave pedestrian and cyclist to go across here. There you are. Okay, that's fine, so let's stop it there. So, I mean, in principle, it can do wonderful things. I think that's a little optimistic for the near future. But nonetheless, these things actually will happen in some contexts. Driving on freeways, okay, so whoops, need to keep going. Can we not go to the... Great, okay, so that's what autonomous vehicles can do, and they have an initiative at MIT to ban the stoplight, and that's what that's about. And then there's Amazon Prime, drones delivering packages by airmail. They recently prosecuted people in the UK for dropping drugs and phones into prisons. They caught them using drones. And this is not so obvious. This is a computer-generated journalism. They just have the facts and they generate something which sounds like a reporter. An outstanding effort by Willie Argo carried the Illini to an 11-5 victory. Argo blasted 2 home runs. So this can all be invented from the basic statistics that you have there. Illinois closer John Anderson got final 7 outs to record his 2nd save of the season. So these are jobs that you think wouldn't be so easy to automate. And here's another one. This is a chain in Japan which has very few staff and has robot sushi making devices, and that's how that reduces its cost. So there are real challenges to automation, and this is the book that Scott referred to, The Rise of the Robots. And I think this is darkly pessimistic, and I'm not as pessimistic, but I am concerned. And I'm concerned because of what we have to do in institutions like this, and my university and so on. 20% of US college graduates are overeducated for their current occupation. Average incomes for college graduates have been in decline for more than a decade. In Europe, roughly 30% of graduates overqualified. In Canada, 27%. China, a remarkable 43% of the workforce are considered to be overeducated. And this is a particularly sobering one. As many as 1/3 of American students who obtain a degree in engineering, science, or other technical fields fail to find a position that utilizes their educational background. So I think the major challenge that I see for the future is finding jobs for young people, and meaningful jobs, and that really is something that should concern us all. Okay, so let me just then finish in the next few minutes about AI, artificial intelligence. Well, this is from a textbook by Stuart Russell from Berkeley and Peter Norvig from Google, a standard textbook on artificial intelligence. The assertion that machines could act as if they were intelligent is called weak AI by philosophers, and the assertion that machines that do so are actually thinking, not just simulating thinking, is called a strong AI hypothesis. So here is 1977, a computer chess tournament. You would have thought playing chess required intelligence, and this is IBM's Deep Blue beating Garry Kasparov, the world champion of chess. And this is, in 2005, another sort of tour de force by IBM Research. This is a system they called IBM Watson, which actually, you all know the game Jeopardy, and actually it's not known very much in the UK, but it is in the US. And here you have to teach the computer all sorts of information, dinosaurs, notable women, English dictionary, instruments, Belgium, composers by country, and of course you give the answer and they have to guess the question. So for example, you would say, the answer is Belgium, and you would ask something like, you know, Brussels is the capital of which country, and the answer would be Belgium. Except the questions are put in a very cryptic thing, and the computer needs to figure out what the actual question is asking. And when it won, it also gave a list for the audience. The contestants couldn't see it. There was Watson playing 2 of the best Jeopardy champions, and they had the top 5 guesses made by Watson. And you could see that some of them were very sensible, and some of them had absolutely no idea what the question was about. So it really didn't understand the question. And this is what philosopher John Searle says. This is his famous Chinese room paradox, and the question he was trying to illustrate is that here they're putting questions in Chinese in this entrance. Here he looks them up in this book and puts symbols out here, which are the answers to these questions. So from outside, it looks as if he understands Chinese. But the point of Searle was that he doesn't actually understand it, it's just an algorithm just looking it up. And people have argued for a long time whether that's an argument against artificial intelligence and so on. And what Searle said about Jeopardy and Watson was that Watson doesn't even know it was playing Jeopardy, let alone that it won. Okay, and this is one of the sobering things. We hear all this hype about AI and how it's going to take over the world. I'd like you to think about this. This is how robust are these deep learning algorithms. They've really done wonderful things for image recognition, for speech and so on very specific data sets. And so this is adversarial noise. So these pictures look the same to me, and must look the same, I think, to most of you. Actually, they differ by a few pixels. So you can't see them, I can't see them. But actually, the actual perturbed images. So here is a stingray, here, you not very well see, and it's trained to recognize a stingray from any other fish or object. And of course, you change the picture by a few pixels, and this carefully trained system, which is trained on hundreds of thousands of images of stingrays, can no longer tell whether it's a stingray or a sea lion. Similarly, this is an ostrich, which is misclassified as a goose. This is a jay, which is misclassified as a junco, even though they have very different colorings. And similarly, this is a water ouzel, misclassified as a redshank. And so they're very, it looks like they've made huge progress, and they have on these very specific data sets. But if you change them slightly, then things are not so robust. And actually, they don't do then any much better than any of the many other machine learning algorithms. So there is a real issue about the robustness of these machine learning algorithms, and whether we're really having generalizable intelligence or whether they're specifically trained. And of course, they're nothing like where a human learns things. Yes, it models a neural network, but the way you tell it from a mouse to an elephant, you show it millions of pictures of a mouse and an elephant, and it'll tell you that's a mouse, that's an elephant. But that's something a 3-year-old kid can do after one, all right? And so that's a very different way of learning. Okay, so what's the future going to be? Is it going to be R2-D2 or BB-8 saving the world? You can talk to it and they have emotion, or is it going to be Skynet and the Terminator coming to get us? Or you're going to fall in love with your computer. This is the movie Her, where he has a wonderful computer who's very sympathetic, who understands him and is really nice. However, she gets bored because he's so slow. And therefore, the computer can then go and interact with many hundreds of thousands of human beings at the same time as interacting with him. And then the computer realizes, actually, these human beings are rather boring. Why don't I interact with their computer? Etc. All right, so that's Her, when you fall in love with their operating system. And then there's the Turing test, right? So this is the famous Turing test that we heard about today. Can machines think by this imitation game? And the movie is quite good. It's nothing like realistic, and Keira Knightley is much more attractive as his wife as his fiancée than it was in the movie, etc., etc. And there was a German spy there, but as far as we know, they never met at Bletchley Park and so on. So the movie's good, but Turing was also not allowed to touch the hardware because he was notoriously bad about doing hardware. So it's a rather unrealistic thing. But nonetheless, the Turing test, where can you tell whether it's a person or a machine just by the responses they give, was the idea of replacing, can machines think? This is a modern version, the science fiction movie Ex Machina, of the Turing test. And this is, I don't want to spoil the movie, but I do recommend you see it. But it comes up with certain things that you're creating an artificial intelligence, and you have various goals. But are they conscious? Are they not conscious? And what you want of an intelligence. In fact, as you can imagine, the artificial intelligence is in the end able to escape, and you can watch the movie for yourself. So a modern view of the Turing test. So in Silicon Valley, we hear a lot about the singularity, the fact that machines are going to be more intelligent than us by 10 years, 20 years, or whatever. The singularity is near, and we're going to be displaced from being the most intelligent community, if you like, of beings on the planet by these super intelligent computers. Or alternatively, is it going to be like Feynman characterized the computer as a really dumb file clerk? They just go over to file, pick up a card, do what it says, go back, pick up another card, and so on. And they do it so damn fast that it looks like they're intelligent. So I think you can guess what Feynman would have said. So, where are we now? Well, I think there are many exciting things to do, both theoretically, understanding algorithms, understanding consciousness. And I'm always slightly amused by this quotation from a fellow philosopher in Boston, from Daniel Dennett: human consciousness is about the last survival history, because I have a book by Daniel Dennett called Consciousness Explained. I read it, didn't explain it to me. So I do, however, think that the neural networks we have now do not think anything like humans think, and maybe that's a sidetrack down there. And can we ever get humans to think? Well, we have, I think, to understand consciousness and the brain, and I think we're a long way from that. So I think there's a long way to go, and I don't think we need to get worried about AI machines taking over the world. I do think we need to worry about jobs for young people, not only in the US, but all over the world. There are going to be large numbers of young people who have no jobs. Unemployment rate in Spain among young people below 25 was 40% at one point. It's now down to something much more reasonable. It's around about 30%. So this is really a challenge because they have no stake in the future, and I think that's the challenge for this generation. Thank you very much for listening. While they're changing over, bringing chairs out for the panel, I can advertise this is the only book Microsoft ever made under a Creative Commons license, so you can download it free, you're encouraged to. But it's about the fact that Stephen Wolfram talked about computational chemistry, computational biology, he called it CompX. What my colleague Jim Gray talked about was X-Info. So along with computational chemistry, there's chemoinformatics. Along with computational biology, bioinformatics. So I think the information side of these fields is a new field, and that's what Jim Gray called the fourth paradigm. And I do recommend, that's what I'm working on now. Big scientific data, and using these algorithms to get science out of these complicated, huge volumes of scientific data. Right, so we all sit